Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight we journey to the warm harbors of the Indian Ocean, where lantern light flickers on wooden decks and the air carries a faint salt haze. The sea is steady, the shoreline quiet, and ships rest at anchor, waiting for the breath of wind that guides them onward. Each evening feels like a pause between pages, a soft rhythm of waiting and watching. So before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. We're talking about the monsoon ports of the Indian Ocean. And when I say monsoon, don't panic. This isn't going to be a violent storm story. This is more like a lullaby of trade winds. Because for centuries, if you wanted to sail from East Africa to India, or from India to Arabia, or from China all the way to Zanzibar, you had to wait for the winds. Literally, people built empires on knowing which direction the breeze would blow, and when. It's history's slowest, laziest, and yet somehow most powerful scheduling system. So picture it, you're a sailor from Yemen in the 12th century. You've got your cargo, maybe frankincense, maybe horses, maybe a load of boring but lucrative dates. You've made it to the port of Calicut in southern India. You want to go home, and you can't. Not because you're broke, not because your boat is broken, but because the wind has decided, not today. The Indian Ocean is like that. For half the year, the wind blows one way, and for the other half, it blows the opposite. You sail with it, or you don't sail at all. So what do? You sit, you wait, and in the meantime, entire multicultural port cities spring up around you because everyone is waiting with you. And here's the thing, those cities weren't quiet backwaters. They were buzzing. Imagine Cairo, but with a sea breeze, or Baghdad, but with palm trees and monsoon rains. Merchants from Africa, Persia, India, China, they all mingled in these coastal hubs. Kilwa on the Swahili coast, Calicut in India, Aden at the mouth of the Red Sea. They were like airports today, except instead of waiting 3 hours at a terminal, you might wait 3 months, which meant you had time to talk, to trade, to gossip, and occasionally to marry into the local community because, let's be real, some sailors never left. The rhythm was almost hypnotic. Summer, winds blowing from the southwest. Ships sail eastward. Winter, winds reverse. Ships sail westward. It was like a giant pendulum across the ocean. And all people had to do was exist in between. Honestly, it's hard to imagine a more sleep-inducing concept than an economy built entirely on scheduled breezes. But don't think of these ports as boring. They were lively, colorful, and kind of weird. You could stroll through a bazaar in Calicut and see Chinese porcelain sitting next to African ivory. You could hear a dozen languages in the same street. And the smells, oh boy, spices, incense, fish drying in the sun, and probably a decent amount of sweat. Because let's be honest, medieval ports were not exactly hygienic wonderlands, and yet people loved it. Kilwa, for example, on the East African coast, became so rich from this trade that its ruler reportedly had a palace decorated with coral stone and even gold, all because he knew when to sail and when to wait. The wind was the stock market ticker of the medieval world. Let's pause for a moment. Now imagine yourself as one of those sailors. You've just arrived in Calicut. The journey took weeks, but you finally made it. You unload your cargo, maybe horses from Arabia, which Indian elites loved for their cavalry. You sell them for pepper, the black gold of the medieval kitchen. Everyone in Europe was obsessed with pepper, and now you can't leave. Not until the winds flip in a few months. So, you settle into port life. You find a little lodging, you drink palm wine in the evenings. You hear stories from a Chinese trader who swears the Mongols are taking over everything up north. You maybe even meet a Gujarati merchant who explains how banking works here. And suddenly you're borrowing money in a port city thousands of miles from home. And all the while, the ocean is just sitting there, calm, waiting for the right season. The funny thing is, this system worked beautifully for centuries in an age before engines, GPS, or weather apps. Sailors still managed to cross half the globe with nothing but sails and seasonal patience. And this waiting created a rhythm of life that was almost meditative. Everything slowed down. Trade wasn't about speed, it was about timing. Miss the wind and you were stuck. Catch it and you could make a fortune. Of course, this also meant some very awkward scenarios. Imagine being a merchant who hated the guy he had to share the port with for 3 months, or a sailor who spent all his money at the bazaar in week 1 and now had to bum food until January. Let's just say port cities were not exactly peaceful monasteries, but they had their charm. Okay, let's float over to one of the most famous ports, Aden, at the mouth of the Red Sea. This place was basically the medieval world's toll booth. If you wanted to go from the Indian Ocean into the Mediterranean, you passed Aden, and Aden's rulers knew it. They taxed everything. But in exchange, they kept the port safe, the markets busy, and the sailors happy enough to wait. And waiting meant spending money, which meant Aden got richer and richer. Here's a fun image. Marco Polo. Yes, that Marco Polo, passing through one of these ports. Did he exaggerate his stories? Absolutely. Did he probably fall asleep listening to sailors drone on about monsoon schedules? Also, yes, but even he couldn't ignore how important these winds and these ports were. They were the veins of global trade. Without them, no silk, no spices, no porcelain, no gold would flow. And let's be honest, without them, we wouldn't have half the cuisines we love today. Curry, dependent on spices shipped by Monsoon. Coffee, yep, it sailed these winds. Even sugar, rice, and citrus fruits traveled across these waters. So the next time you sweeten your tea with sugar and add a squeeze of lemon, you're basically tasting the Indian Ocean trade system. Delicious, right? But again, calm. This was not a fast-moving, action-packed history. It was slow, rhythmic, predictable, and that's what made it work. So, we've set the stage. The monsoon winds blow like a giant pendulum, and medieval sailors are basically hostages to the seasons, which, as you can imagine, gave port cities a certain mood, a kind of half-busy, half-bored vibe. Everyone had somewhere to be, but no one could get there until nature said yes. Let's zoom in on one of those places, Kilwa, down on the Swahili coast of East Africa. Today it's mostly ruins, tumbled coral stone walls, a few lonely arches, but back in the 14th century, Kilwa was the spot, the Venice of Africa. If Venice was hot, salty, and full of dhows instead of gondolas. Merchants came from as far away as India, and even Volen, unloading silk, porcelain, and beads. In return, they picked up gold from the African interior, ivory, and slaves, because of course, every historical economy has a dark side. But Kilwa wasn't just about money. It had style. Coral stone mosques, fancy houses with courtyards, Rulers who thought it was a great idea to build palaces right on the sea so everyone knew they were rich. One traveler, Ibn Battuta, who basically spent his life as the medieval world's nosest tourist, visited Kilwa and gushed about it. He said the Sultan was generous, the people were pious, and the city itself was one of the most beautiful in the world. Did Ibn Battuta exaggerate? Constant. But if even half of what he said was true, Kilwa was impressive, and again, all of this wealth flowed in with the monsoon winds. Ships arrived, docked, unloaded, reloaded, and then waited. Imagine hundreds of sailors and merchants hanging around for weeks on end. You can practically hear the bargaining in the bazaars, the hammering of ship repairs, and the endless gossip. Did you hear the Chinese brought porcelain plates the size of shields? Did you hear the Arabs are complaining again about Indian pepper prices? Same energy as airport lounges, just with more palm trees. Now, while Kilwa was dazzling in its way, let's float eastward. Calicut, modern-day Kozhikode, in Kerala, India. If Kilwa was Venice, Calicut was kind of like Dubai, a buzzing hub, famous for trade, and very aware of its own importance. The king of Calicut, known as the Zamarin, basically turned the city into an open market. Everyone was welcome, as long as they paid their dues and behaved. This made Calicut the go-to spot for pepper, black pepper, the one spice medieval Europe could not shut up about. People in England and France would mortgage half their estate for a handful of peppercorns, which is hilarious considering today we just shake it over fries without thinking. So Calicut thrived. Sailors loved it because it was reliable. Merchants loved it because you could always find buyers, and the Zamarin, he loved it because every sack of pepper meant more wealth flowing into his coffers. Of course, there were occasional squabbles, Arabs trying to dominate trade, locals pushing back. Eventually, the Portuguese barging in like over-eager party crashers. But in the golden days, Calicut was like a living, breathing marketplace, humming to the rhythm of the monsoon. And here's where life in port got kind of interesting. Because remember, sailors weren't just dropping by for a quick trade. They had to stay, sometimes for months. That meant renting houses, making friends, sometimes even marrying locals, which is why the Swahili coast today still shows a blend of African and Arab influences. And in India, coastal communities blended with Persian, Arab, and even Chinese touches. Monsoon ports weren't just commercial, they were cultural mixers. You could walk down a street and see a Yemeni merchant in a turban, a Gujarati trader in cotton robes, and a Chinese sailor with tattoos, all buying snacks from the same food stall. Speaking of snacks, let's not underestimate the food culture here. Waiting months in port meant eating a lot. Imagine feasting on rice dishes spiced with cloves and cardamom from the islands, or flatbreads dipped in curries flavored with pepper straight from Calicut's warehouses. Maybe you washed it down with palm wine, maybe with tamarind water, not Michelin-starred, but definitely better than whatever was on the ship. And with sailors from across the world swapping recipes, these ports became accidental culinary laboratories. Honestly, the birth of global fusion cuisine was probably in a sweaty monsoon harbor. The no-port story is complete without Malacca. Let's float further east to the Straits of Malacca. By the 15th century, this city was a juggernaut. If Kilwa was Venice and Calicut was Dubai, then Malacca was Los Angeles. Busy, diverse, and a little bit chaotic, the Sultan of Malacca realized his city sat at the choke point of all east-west trade. You want to get spices from the Malaccas to India. Malacca. You want Chinese silk to make its way to Arabia. Malacca. It was the funnel, and everyone had to pour through. And Malacca embraced it. Its rulers made the port safe, regulated trade, and welcomed merchants from all backgrounds. So much so that by the early 1500s, people said you could hear over 80 different languages spoken in its markets. That's not a city, that's a human orchestra. And of course, everyone was waiting on the winds. Ships would dock, sailors would spill into town, and for months the city would swell with people, goods, and noise. Imagine the buzz, spices piled high in warehouses, gold coins clinking in counting houses, parrots squawking from cages, and sailors loudly pretending they weren't broke. And yet, underneath all the noise, the rhythm remained calm. Wait for the wind, prepare, trade, rest, repeat. If medieval history had a soundtrack, the monsoon ports would be a slow drumbeat, steady and unhurried. Now, don't imagine these ports as perfect utopias. They were crowded, dirty, and sometimes dangerous. Pirates prowled the seas, disease spread in packed quarters, and occasionally, rulers got greedy and decided taxes should triple overnight. But somehow, the system held because the winds didn't care about politics. The winds kept blowing, the ships kept sailing, and the ports kept thriving. Let's take a sleepy stroll back through one of those bazaars. It's twilight in Calicut. The sun sets over the Arabian Sea, turning the water pink and gold. Lanterns flicker to life. Merchants lay out their goods: pepper, ginger, cinnamon, silk, porcelain bowls that gleam like moonlight. A muezzin calls to prayer from a mosque, while just down the street, Hindu bells chime in a temple. The air smells like roasting fish and cardamom. Sailors haggle, kids run barefoot through the alleys, and somewhere, a group of traders sit cross-legged, counting coins under the dim glow of an oil lamp. You can almost hear the hum of voices blending with the sound of waves. And above it all, the sailors know they'll be here for weeks, maybe months. The wind decides. And really, that's the magic of these monsoon ports. They weren't about rushing, they were about waiting. Waiting turned into community. Waiting turned into culture. And in that slow rhythm, the Indian Ocean connected the world long before planes or steamships ever did. So we've talked about the big picture winds, trade routes, the rise of Kilwa, Calicut, and Malacca. But let's zoom in a little closer. Let's step into the daily life of a sailor, a merchant, or even just a poor dock worker stuck in one of these ports. Because honestly, what did people actually do during those endless months of waiting? Spoiler, a lot of eating, praying, bargaining, and sometimes making questionable life choices. Imagine you're a sailor from Hormuz, stranded in Calicut in the 14th century. Your ship is anchored, your captain has sold half the cargo, and now you've got time, too much time. First, there's the work. Ships needed repairs constantly. Salt water eats wood like it's a snack, so your mornings might involve scraping barnacles, patching sails, or arguing with carpenters about why they're charging double just because they know you can't leave town. Ports had entire cottage industries built around keeping ships seaworthy because no sailor trusted the sea with a leaky hull. Once that's done, though, you've got the rest of the day. And let's be real, bored sailors are not exactly models of self-control. Gambling was huge. Dice games, card-like games, betting on cockfights, you name it. If something moved, sailors probably bet on it. Drinking was another favorite: palm wine, date wine, rice beer. It depended on the region, but alcohol always seemed to find its way into the mix. Some sailors probably swore they'd stay sober until the winds turned, but 3 months is a long time to stay virtuous. Religion also anchored life in these ports. The Indian Ocean was crisscrossed by Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and later Christians, and they all built their little corners in port cities. So you'd hear the call to prayer echoing across Kilwa at dawn, while temple bells rang in Calicut and Buddhist chants floated from shrines further east. Sailors who were far from home often found comfort in visiting familiar spaces of worship, or at least ones that felt close enough, and since waiting around tends to make people reflect on their life choices, let's just say the mosques, temples, and shrines were never empty. Of course, not everyone was shopping. Some people were, let's call it social networking. When you leave men with money and time in a city full of taverns and entertainment houses, things happen. Ports developed reputations for their nightlife, music, dancing, companionship of various kinds. Local rulers usually looked the other way because, hey, sailors spending money meant more taxes. And while the poetry makes port cities sound exotic and spiritual, the reality was probably a little more messy. Think spilled wine, too loud singing, and at least one fight every Friday night. And then there was the market life. Ports were basically extended shopping malls, except instead of Forever 21 and Starbucks, you had stalls selling ivory bangles, piles of pepper, and bolts of silk. Merchants strutted through bazaars like influencers, showing off their wealth and taste. Sailors, if they had a little spending money left, splurged on trinkets to bring home, maybe a glazed Chinese bowl, maybe a carved sandalwood box. For a sailor's family, back home, these weren't just souvenirs, they were proof you'd made it to the edge of the known world and back. Now, let's talk about food again, because nothing fills long hours like eating. Sailors often found themselves tasting dishes they'd never even imagined before. A Persian sailor might sit down in Malacca and be handed a bowl of noodles flavored with soy sauce. An Indian merchant in Aden might bite into dates stuffed with almonds. An African trader in Calicut might try rice soaked in coconut milk with spicy curry. And let's not forget coffee. By the late medieval period, coffee from Yemen started circulating through these very ports. Sailors who needed to stay awake on night watch suddenly had a new friend. And yes, even back then, people probably had heated debates over whether it was too bitter, but it wasn't all rowdy. There were also quieter, stranger interactions. Picture a Yemeni merchant sipping tea with a Chinese sailor, both of them trying to explain their homelands with hand gestures because they don't share a language, or an African ivory trader picking up a few words of Sanskrit just so he can haggle more effectively in Calicut. These little moments, awkward, funny, sometimes profound, were what stitched cultures together. Over generations, those stitches became seams, and that's why, even today, Swahili, a language born on the East African coast, carries Arabic words woven into its structure. That's centuries of sailors waiting for the wind, trying to chat with their neighbors. Another part of port life, stories. Sailors told tales the way modern people scroll Instagram constantly, and with heavy editing. Sitting around a fire, someone might describe monstrous sea creatures in the far reaches of the ocean, or golden islands that shone at sunrise. Were they true? Absolutely not. But did people listen? Anyway, every time, and these stories traveled, a sailor in Calicut might hear a Persian version of Sinbad's adventures. A Chinese merchant might hear about strange men with tails supposedly seen on the coast of Africa. Storytelling filled the long evenings, keeping boredom at bay and sometimes planting seeds of myths that outlived the sailors themselves. Religion also anchored life in these ports. The Indian Ocean was crisscrossed by Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and later Christians, and they all built their little corners in port cities. So you'd hear the call to prayer echoing across Kilwa at dawn, while temple bells rang in Calicut and Buddhist chants floated from shrines further east. Sailors who were far from home often found comfort in visiting familiar spaces of worship, or at least ones that felt close enough, and since waiting around tends to make people reflect on their life choices, let's just say the mosques, temples, and shrines were never empty. And then there was the market life. Ports were basically extended shopping malls, except instead of Forever 21 and Starbucks, you had stalls selling ivory bangles, piles of pepper, and bolts of silk. Merchants strutted through bazaars like influencers, showing off their wealth and taste. Sailors, if they had a little spending money left, splurged on trinkets to bring home, maybe a glazed Chinese bowl, maybe a carved sandalwood box. For a sailor's family, back home, these weren't just souvenirs, they were proof you'd made it to the edge of the known world and back. Of course, not everyone was shopping. Some people were. Let's call it social networking. When you leave men with money and time in a city full of taverns and entertainment houses, things happen. Ports developed reputations for their nightlife, music, dancing, companionship of various kinds. Local rulers usually looked the other way because, hey, sailors spending money meant more taxes. And while the poetry makes port cities sound exotic and spiritual, the reality was probably a little more messy. Think spilled wine, too loud singing, and at least one fight every Friday night. But it wasn't all rowdy. There were also quieter, stranger interactions. Picture a Yemeni merchant sipping tea with a Chinese sailor, both of them trying to explain their homelands with hand gestures because they don't share a language, or an African ivory trader picking up a few words of Sanskrit just so he can haggle more effectively in Calicut. These little moments, awkward, funny, sometimes profound, were what stitched cultures together. Over generations, those stitches became seams, and that's why, even today, Swahili, a language born on the East African coast, carries Arabic words woven into its structure. That's centuries of sailors waiting for the wind, trying to chat with their neighbors. Now, let's talk about food again, because nothing fills long hours like eating. Sailors often found themselves tasting dishes they'd never even imagined before. A Persian sailor might sit down in Malacca and be handed a bowl of noodles flavored with soy sauce. An Indian merchant in Aden might bite into dates stuffed with almonds. An African trader in Calicut might try rice soaked in coconut milk with spicy curry. And let's not forget coffee. By the late medieval period, coffee from Yemen started circulating through these very ports. Sailors who needed to stay awake on night watch suddenly had a new friend. And yes, even back then, people probably had heated debates over whether it was too bitter. Another part of port life, stories. Sailors told tales the way modern people scroll Instagram constantly, and with heavy editing. Sitting around a fire, someone might describe monstrous sea creatures in the far reaches of the ocean, or golden islands that shone at sunrise. Were they true? Absolutely not. But did people listen? Anyway, every time, and these stories traveled, a sailor in Calicut might hear a Persian version of Sinbad's adventures. A Chinese merchant might hear about strange men with tails supposedly seen on the coast of Africa. Storytelling filled the long evenings, keeping boredom at bay, and sometimes planting seeds of myths that outlived the sailors themselves. Now, we can't forget the less glamorous side: disease, crowded ports, Unfamiliar climates and travelers from every corner of the world meant illness spread quickly. Malaria, dysentery, fevers of mysterious origins. They all lurked in the background. Healers and apothecaries did their best, selling herbal remedies and talismans. Some probably worked, many did not. But when you're stuck in port with no way out, you'll try anything, and as depressing as it sounds, sometimes entire crews shrank during their waiting season, which made the survivors even more superstitious about timing, rituals and prayers to make the next voyage safer. Through all of this, time itself moved differently in the ports. Sailors marked their calendars not by weeks or months, but by winds. When the southwest wind returns, we'll leave. It created a strange suspension. Lives were lived in cycles of waiting and sailing, and that rhythm, slow and steady, spread across the entire ocean world. Let's picture one last scene before we drift further. It's night in Malacca. The air is heavy with spice and sea salt. Oil lamps glow along narrow wooden streets. Sailors sit cross-legged in smoky taverns, arguing about pepper prices. A group of children chase each other, their laughter mixing with the clang of hammers as shipwrights work late on repairs. A muezzin calls to prayer in Arabic, answered by bells ringing in a small Buddhist temple down the lane. And the ocean? Quiet, patient, waiting for the wind to change, just like everyone else. That was the Monsoon port's gift and curse. The wind was the ultimate schedule keeper. No one could cheat it. No one could rush it. So people lived, ate, traded, prayed, gossiped, and dreamed until the day came when sails could finally unfurl and the ocean once again carried them away. By now you've probably noticed a theme. Life in the monsoon ports was slow, steady, and patient. But let's not forget, where there's trade, there's money, and where there's money, there's always someone in charge, trying to skim their cut. These ports weren't just casual meetups for sailors with too much time on their hands. They were political machines, and the rulers who controlled them knew exactly how to turn waiting into profit. Take it Eden at the mouth of the Red Sea. If you wanted to sail into the Mediterranean, you had to pass Eden, and the rulers of Eden treated their port like the world's most lucrative toll booth. Ships rolled in, loaded with pepper, porcelain, or textiles, and before they could pass through, the Sultan's officials showed up with clipboards. Well, metaphorical clipboards, and said, "Nice cargo. Shame if you couldn't unload it here." Translation: taxes are not the kind you could negotiate away. Aladdin was rich precisely because it made everyone pay, and people did, because what else could you do? The winds weren't going to reverse just for your convenience. This wasn't unique. Everywhere across the Indian Ocean, rulers realized that monsoon ports were money printers. Calicuts, Zamarin, Malaccas, sultans, Kilaueas, sheikhs. They all set up systems to squeeze revenue out of sailors. Docking fees, market fees, security fees, and the ever-popular special gift for the ruler fee. You name it, they charged it. Some of these were official taxes. Others were just scams dressed up as tradition. Imagine arriving in port with a full ship, only to have some official announce that every foreign trader was expected to give a hospitality gift to the palace. Not exactly optional. And yet, for the most part, people tolerated it. Why? Because the rulers actually kept things running. They provided markets, storage warehouses, guards to keep thieves in check, and sometimes even arbitration courts where merchants could settle disputes. In a world where pirates prowled the seas and rival ports might try to undercut you, Having a strong ruler who could guarantee order was worth the taxes, even if you complained about it over palm wine later. Of course, not every ruler was efficient. Some were greedy, some were paranoid, and some were just eccentric. Take Malacca again. The city became a booming hub under a line of sultans who actively welcomed foreigners, but that also meant layers of bureaucracy. A Chinese merchant might find himself filling out endless records just to sell a chest of porcelain. Meanwhile, the Sultan's officials were happily pocketing bribes to speed up the process. A bureaucratic corruption is older than the Monsoon itself. And then there were the royal personalities. The Sultan of Kilwa, for example, reportedly built himself a palace, so fancy it had a floor of coral stone inlaid with gold. Why? Because subtlety was not the point. He wanted every sailor waiting in his port to look up at that palace and think, wow, this guy is loaded, which in turn made Kilwa seem more important, which brought in more merchants. It was marketing by architecture. A little gaudy? Sure, but it worked. Rulers also played politics with the monsoon calendar. If you're a king and you know merchants are stuck in your port for 3 months, you can stage parades, festivals, and feasts to show off your power. Sailors and merchants would watch, gossip, and then carry those stories home. The Sultan of Malacca is so generous. He gave gold coins to the poor during Ramadan. The Zamorin of Calicut is so powerful. He parades elephants through the streets every month. Whether or not those stories were exaggerated, they spread, and rulers loved it. Free power, powered by the winds. But let's not forget the scams. Oh, the scams. If you were a foreign sailor, you were basically walking around with a target on your back. Local money changers happily offered to convert your coins at rates that somehow always favored them. Dockside agents offered to protect your goods, then mysteriously lost half of them. Street vendors sold you spices that turned out to be half sawdust. And if you dared complain, well, good luck convincing a local judge that a hometown merchant cheated you. The court almost always sided with the local. Shocking. Still, there was a balance. Rulers understood that if ports got too corrupt, merchants would simply stop coming. The Indian Ocean world was wide, and there was always another harbor down the coast. So scams existed, but outright chaos was rare. Ports walked a fine line between squeezing travelers for every coin and keeping them comfortable enough to come back next season. Think of it like the world's earliest version of customer retention strategy. Religion also played a role in politics. Kilwa's rulers, for example, emphasized their Islamic faith as a way to bond with Arab traders. They built mosques, supported scholars, and presented themselves as pious rulers who could be trusted. Calicut's Zamorin, meanwhile, leaned into Hindu traditions, but still made space for Muslim merchants, because pepper profits outweighed theological disputes. Malacca's sultans officially converted to Islam, which gave them ties to Muslim traders from Arabia and beyond. It was part faith, part business strategy, and it worked because merchants liked rulers who shared their customs. Waiting months in a port felt a little easier if the Friday prayer sounded familiar. Now, let's look at how rulers sometimes micromanaged the waiting itself. In Aden, officials controlled where ships could dock. In Calicut, merchants had to store goods in royal warehouses before selling. In Malacca, every ship had to register with the harbour master, who recorded exactly what was being traded. On paper, these were about order and safety. In reality, they were also about control. If you control the waiting, you control the money. And naturally, some rulers got carried away. Imagine being a merchant who waited 6 months for the winds to turn, only to have the ruler suddenly announce a new tax right before departure. What could you do? Argue you'd just miss the season and be stuck another 6 months. So you paid, probably while muttering very unflattering things about the Sultan under your breath. Despite all this, many merchants returned again and again. Why? Because the system worked. The ports were safe enough, the rulers predictable enough, and the winds always reliable. As much as sailors cursed the taxes, they also knew they'd make it back in profit once their pepper ivory or silk sold in Cairo or Venice. It was a game of patience, annoyance, and eventual payoff. Let's close this part with a little scene. Picture yourself in Malacca. It's the late 15th century. You're a merchant from Gujarat. You've been here 2 months already. Every day, you walk past the Sultan's palace, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the sun. You've paid your fees, greased a few palms, and even attended a royal feast where the Sultan showed off his elephants. You're broke from bribes, but your pepper cargo is selling well. Tonight, you sit in a tavern, sipping palm wine, listening to sailors complain about docking taxes. You nod along, but deep down, you know you'll be back next year, because this is the price of doing business on the Monsoon's clock. And with that, we can drift forward to how these waiting worlds didn't just shape trade, but also shaped ideas, religions, and even languages. Because the ports weren't just toll booths, they were conversation hubs for the medieval globe. By now, you can see how the ports weren't just about trade. Sure, spices and silk kept the economy alive, but something else was happening in those months of waiting. While sailors played dice, rulers schemed about taxes, and merchants haggled in the bazaars, ideas were also quietly traveling from one end of the Indian Ocean to the other. And honestly, that might be the most fascinating part, because it turned the ports into something like medieval internet cafes. Slow, salty, a little grimy, but buzzing with information. Let's start with religion. The Indian Ocean was one of the great highways of faith. Islam, for example, spread across the coasts not by armies, but by merchants. Muslim traders prayed in Kilwa, Calicut, Malacca, and beyond, and slowly, local communities began to adopt their faith. Sometimes it started with intermarriage. A sailor stayed behind, married a local woman, and their children grew up in a Muslim household. Over generations, entire cities turned into Muslim majority hub, the Swahili coast, Malacca, parts of Sumatra. All of these places became Islamic cultural centers, thanks to sailors who were originally just trying to sell a boatload of horses or date. But Islam wasn't the only faith on the move. Hinduism traveled eastward into Southeast Asia, shaping kingdoms in Java, Bali, and Cambodia. Buddhism, too, carried by monks and merchants, it seeped into port cities, leaving behind little shrines and grand temples alike. Imagine a Buddhist monk from Sri Lanka sharing tea with a Chinese sailor in a Malaccan tavern, both of them trying to outdo each other with philosophical parables. Meanwhile, just down the street, Muslim scholars were debating the finer points of trade law. That was the vibe, overlapping conversations, overlapping worlds, and let's not forget Christianity. Long before European colonial powers barged in, there were already Christian communities in India, Ethiopia, and Arabia, tied together by these same trade winds. Syrian Christian merchants operated out of Kelera, while Ethiopian sailors crossed into Yemen, carrying their faith along with their cargo. The Indian Ocean was never a one-faith zone. It was a patchwork stitched together by Monsoon. Now, language. Oh, the languages. If you think modern airports are a mess of accents, imagine a 14th century port. You had Arabic spoken by merchants from Yemen, Gujarati traders speaking their dialects, Tamil voices from southern India, Chinese sailors barking commands in their own tongue, and Swahili slowly emerging as a hybrid of Bantu and Arabic. And then there were translators, people who built entire careers out of being able to say, "How much for the pepper?" in 6 different languages. Without them, half the deals in the port would have ended in hand gestures and shouting. This constant mixing gave rise to pidgins, simplified trade languages, cobbled together for the sake of getting a deal done. Over time, some of these evolved into full languages. Swahili is the clearest example, born out of centuries of coastal Africans talking to Arab traders. It eventually grew into a rich, poetic language of its own, carrying both Bantu roots and Arabic borrowings. That's what happens when people wait around together for centuries. They invent new ways to talk. Ideas weren't just about religion or language. No, knowledge traveled too. Port cities were little libraries of gossip, practical tips, and sometimes surprisingly advanced science. Sailors swapped navigation tricks, how to read stars, how to use a particular constellation to guide you east. Merchants compared notes on monsoon patterns. Last year the winds came late, this year expect them earlier. Herbal remedies, recipes, bits of philosophy, even jokes, all of it moved with the wind. And let's not ignore the scholars. Some of them were actual professionals, sent by rulers to collect books and ideas. Others were just curious travelers. Chinese fleets under Admiral Zheng He in the early 15th century carried translators, scientists, and scribes who carefully recorded what they saw in places like Calicut and Malacca. Meanwhile, Arab scholars like al-Masudi or Ibn Battuta scribbled down observations that later generations would pore over. They might not have gotten every detail right. Okay, they definitely exaggerated a lot, but they preserved the sense of a world connected by patient winds. The ports were also places where technology spread. Take shipbuilding. Arab Daz had their famous latent sails, which allowed them to tack more efficiently with the wind. Chinese junks were massive, with compartmentalized hulls that made them sturdier. In Indian ports, craftsmen borrowed from both styles, creating hybrid ships that could handle long voyages. These weren't isolated inventions, they were collaborative projects, hammered together in busy dockyards where carpenters from different traditions literally worked side by side. Even banking practices spread. Merchants in India used hundis, early versions of checks, that allowed someone in Calicut to pay a partner in Aden without carrying bags of coins across the sea. Muslim merchants brought in ideas of credit and partnership contracts. Chinese traders introduced their own record-keeping systems. By the late medieval period, a savvy merchant in Malacca could juggle IOUs, letters of credit, and debt notes almost as easily as a modern business person manages invoices, which, let's be honest, was way more efficient than lugging a chest of silver across pirate-infested waters. But maybe the most human part of all this was the small, unrecorded stuff. A sailor from Sumatra teaching a Swahili kid how to tie a new kind of knot, a Persian poet reciting verses in a Calicut courtyard, while an Indian musician tried to set them to local instruments, a Chinese herbalist trading remedies with an Arab doctor, both of them skeptical but curious. These aren't the stories that made it into the chronicles, but they happened every day. Waiting months in port meant lives intersected in ways that left traces, even if no one wrote them down. And just as goods left lasting marks, you can still find Chinese porcelain shards, along the Swahili coast, so too did these ideas. Whole cities reshaped themselves around this cultural mixing. Malacca became a melting pot of Malay, Chinese, Arab, and Indian traditions. Zanzibar blended Swahili, Arabic, and African cultures into something unique. Even inland kingdoms felt the ripple effect, because their elites wanted the prestige goods, the religions, or the technologies that came in from the sea. Of course, not everyone loved this mixing. Some rulers worried about foreign influence. Others tried to keep tight control over which religions or ideas gained traction. But the truth was, once the winds blew ideas ashore, they were hard to stop. You can regulate pepper, you can tax silk, but you can't stop sailors from swapping stories over a cup of palm wine. Let's drift into another little night scene. It's Malacca again, around 1500. You're sitting on a low wooden bench by the docks. Lanterns sway in the warm breeze. A group of Arab sailors nearby chant evening prayers, their voices rising and falling in rhythm. Just down the pier, Chinese traders laugh as they share rice wine. Behind you, an Indian storyteller gathers a small crowd, weaving tales of gods and heroes in a slow, hypnotic voice. You don't understand every word, but you don't need to. The mix of sounds, scents, and rhythms tells you exactly what this port is: a crossroads, waiting for the wind, but alive with the hum of the world. And that's really the magic of these places. The ports weren't just waiting rooms for merchants. They were incubators of culture, powered by the simple fact that the wind only blew one way at a time. And while people waited, they talked, they prayed, they cooked, they sang, and in doing so, they stitched the medieval world together in ways no army or empire could. By now, we've seen how the Monsoon ports worked like clockwork, a natural, seasonal clock, powered by the winds. People sailed, they traded, they waited, and this system was stable for centuries. Empires rose and fell inland, dynasties changed, but the Indian Ocean just kept breathing in and out with the monsoon. But nothing lasts forever. By the late 15th century, a new set of ships started poking around the edges of this world. They came from Europe, and if there's one thing Europeans were famous for in this era, it was showing up uninvited, making everything complicated, and then acting like they owned the place. Let's start with the Portuguese. Around 1498, Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, a trip that must have felt like trying to outsmart nature itself, and eventually stumbled into Calicut. He expected the locals to fall at his feet. Spoiler, they did not. The Zamorin of Calicut listened politely as da Gama explained that he wanted spices. The Zamorin probably smiled and thought, "Congratulations, you've just reinvented the concept of being a merchant." But here's the thing. The Europeans didn't come to play by the old rules. They didn't want to wait for the winds in the same way. They didn't want to pay the regular port taxes or shuffle through the usual bureaucracy. They wanted monopolies, control, and when they didn't get it, they reached for cannons. Now, let's keep this calm. Don't picture big naval battles. Picture instead the slow, awkward collision of two rhythms, the patient breathing of the monsoon world and the restless, greedy fidgeting of Europe. Portuguese ships sat uneasily in these ports, their sailors unused to the long waiting seasons. They grumbled about having to mingle with Muslim and Hindu merchants. They distrusted the easy cosmopolitan mix of the bazaar, and they especially hated paying fees to rulers they thought were beneath them. The result? A lot of tension. Calicut, once a hub of open trade, became a battleground of egos. The Portuguese wanted exclusive rights to Petra. The Arabs wanted to keep their centuries-old networks intact. The Zamorin just wanted everyone to keep buying and selling without turning his city into a war zone. But of course, subtlety wasn't exactly Portugal's strong suit. They built forts, fired cannons, and turned peaceful harbors into anxious, guarded spaces. And this wasn't just Calicut. Quilá, once the jewel of the Swahili coast, felt the pressure too. Portuguese fleets sailed down the coast, demanding submission, tribute, and partnerships that were less partnership and more extortion. Quilá's coral palaces, which had dazzled Ibn Battuta, eventually crumbled under the weight of shifting power. The rhythm of waiting for the monsoon winds was still there, but the atmosphere had changed. Meanwhile, in Malacca, the Portuguese were even more dramatic. In 1511, they outright seized the city. The Sultan fled, the Portuguese planted their flag, and suddenly the most vibrant multicultural port in the Indian Ocean had new landlords. For sailors, this meant new rules, higher taxes, suspicious guards, fewer taverns where you could relax without some official breathing down your neck. The monsoon still blew, but the easy flow of culture and trade had been interrupted. Now, it's important not to paint this as a total collapse. The Indian Ocean system was resilient. Merchants at it, some just shifted routes, avoiding Portuguese forts. Others cut side deals. Many communities carried on with business as usual, muttering about the Europeans, but still waiting patiently for the winds. But slowly the balance tipped. European ships brought more firepower, more rigid ideas about control, and eventually competition from the Dutch and English. And here's the irony. For all their noise, the Europeans still had to obey the monsoon. Their cannons couldn't change the wind. Their forts couldn't speed up the seasons. Even the Portuguese had to sit in port for months, twiddling their thumbs, drinking too much, and probably annoying every local they met. The monsoon was the great equalizer. You could be a Swahili trader in a dhow, or a Portuguese captain in a carrack. Either way, if the wind said no, you weren't going anywhere. Still, the tone of the ports shifted. What had once been laid back, waiting, became more tense. Suspicion replaced easy mingling. Merchants had to think about politics as much as prices. And over time, the slow, organic rhythm of the Indian Ocean gave way to the sharper edges of global empires. Let's picture a sleepy scene in this new era. It's the early 1500s in Malacca. Now under Portuguese control, the bazaars are still busy, but quieter. Arabic traders haggle in hushed voices, careful not to draw too much attention. Chinese merchants still unload porcelain, but they keep a wary eye on the soldiers in European armor. A group of Portuguese sailors sit on barrels of pepper, grumbling about the humidity, wishing they were home, and definitely not learning the local language. The wind blows softly through the straits, the same as it always did, but the mood has changed. The monsoon cycle, patient and predictable, still dictated life, but layered over it now was the noise of cannons, the arrogance of foreign crowns, and the first shadows of colonial rule. The ports were still crossroads of the world, still filled with smells of spice and the murmur of many languages. But they were no longer quite as free, quite as open, or quite as sleepy. This story closes, reminding us that every end is only a doorway. Beyond it lies another world, another question, another wonder waiting to be told. This is the candlelit courts of Charlemagne, power, ritual, and nightfall in the Carolingian Empire. When evening began to fall over the lands of the Carolingian Empire, The scene was rarely quiet. Despite what we might imagine, a medieval night was not simply darkness and silence, though it certainly leaned that way for the majority of people. For peasants and townsfolk, dusk meant chores finishing, fires damped, animals shut in. The day ended with very little light, and most households drifted into sleep not long after. But within the palaces and halls where Charlemagne and his court lingered, the descent of night was more of a transformation, a slow shift into a world of flickering light, long shadows, and rituals designed as much to impress as to guide one's feet to the next seat at the feast table. Charlemagne, also known as Charles the Great, reigned from 768 until 814, first as king of the Franks, and later crowned emperor of the Romans in 800. His empire stretched across a good share of Western and Central Europe. He was tall for the time, broad-shouldered, and had the reputation of being both formidable and pragmatic. While his daytime court was filled with petitions, laws, and the shuffling of messengers carrying news from the farthest corners of his realm, nighttime carried another rhythm. If the morning belonged to politics, the evening belonged to performance. Candles were the defining feature of that world. They weren't just practical little sticks of wax with wicks. They were symbols. Having candles at all was a mark of wealth. Beeswax candles in particular were expensive, far cleaner and brighter than the smoky tallow ones burned by common folk. For Charlemagne's court, the sight of beeswax candles glowing in iron or bronze holders meant an atmosphere carefully cultivated. Light was not distributed evenly, but in glowing pools, leaving corners of the great hall in shadow while picking out the embroidered hem of a robe or the gleam of a golden goblet. To move through such a room was to drift in and out of visibility, one's face caught in light before dissolving into darkness again. The effect was as useful politically as it was practical. It reminded those present who commanded the resources to fill a hall with candles, and who must watch from the shadows. The court did not live only in Aachen, the later capital, with its famous chapel, but moved constantly. Wherever Charlemagne and his retinue stopped, the rhythm was similar. The evening meal became a stage. Charlemagne himself was not ostentatious by preference. He favored plain clothes, simple food, and disliked elaborate banquets. According to Einhard, his biographer, he often ate roasted meat with bread and vegetables, washed down with modest quantities of drink. But the court around him was not built on modesty alone. There were noble visitors to impress, alliances to cement, and rivals to quietly diminish through displays of abundance. So, as darkness fell, servants carried in trays of food, brought out jugs of wine, and tended to the candles that gave the gathering its faintly otherworldly glow. Rituals at night were powerful in part because they separated the ruler from the day-to-day noise of administration. In daylight, Charlemagne was surrounded by scribes, officials, and scholars debating the pronunciation of Latin or the phrasing of law codes. At night, he was instead surrounded by song, storytelling, and the ritual patterns of hospitality. Guests were welcomed, seats were chosen with care, and everyone noticed where each person sat in relation to the emperor. A place closer to him suggested favor. A seat further down the table might be a hint or a warning that one's influence had cooled. Candles illuminated these hierarchies just enough to be obvious. The evenings often included music, not soaring symphonies. Those were centuries away, but the strumming of lyres or the chanting of songs from the Frankish or Germanic traditions. Latin hymns could also fill the air, particularly if clerics were present. Night had always been a time that made people nervous, so filling it with structured sound gave a sense of order. Even in these moments, Charlemagne's reforms showed through. He was deeply invested in the use of music in religious settings, encouraging uniform liturgy across his empire, so the candles that flickered in the great halls of Aachen or Paderborn did not just light banquets, but also gatherings where voices rose together in chant. It is easy to imagine the emperor's mind at such times. Though we must resist inventing thoughts, what can be said is that he was aware of the symbolic power of light. His Palatine chapel at Aachen was designed with mosaics and marble that caught what little light candles provided, multiplying the impression of radiance. Visitors often describe the sensation of walking into a space where small flames seemed to create far more illumination than expected. It was both comforting and unsettling, an impression that echoed the dual nature of imperial rule itself. In a world without electric light, darkness was both a physical and spiritual concern. People feared what they couldn't see, and moralists warned against sins committed under cover of night. For a ruler like Charlemagne, mastering the night through controlled light was more than convenience. It was part of his authority. He tamed not only lands and peoples, but also the terrifying uncertainty of nightfall. To sit in a candlelit hall under his gaze was to experience a controlled version of darkness, a safe one, provided by imperial power. Night was also a time for ritualized relaxation. After long days of legal hearings and council sessions, the emperor often invited learned men to join him. Scholars such as Alcuin of York might sit nearby, ready to discuss matters of faith, language, or philosophy. These were not boisterous late-night debates. They were measured conversations, punctuated by the occasional raising of a cup, or the sound of a servant adjusting the candles. The rhythm was slow, steady, almost hypnotic. The emperor's personal habits also shaped these evenings. He is said to have enjoyed listening to history read aloud, often works by Roman authors, though he sometimes had trouble staying awake during longer sessions. The irony of a ruler who forged much of medieval Europe nodding off to Roman histories by candlelight is hard to ignore. Still, this image of him drifting towards sleep as the hall glowed faintly and the voices of readers droned on has its charm. It humanizes a figure often remembered only for conquest and reform. Around him, the courtiers had their own rituals. For some, evenings were opportunities to angle for favor, slipping compliments into conversations or being strategically helpful in passing dishes. Others tried to vanish into the shadows, hoping not to attract attention. A candlelit hall could be unforgiving in its way. It revealed just enough of a smirk, a frown, or a whispered comment to make one's intentions noticeable. The emperor, keen-eyed, despite his aging years, was not known for missing much. The use of light also intersected with religion. Night prayers, vigils, and other observances frequently required candles. In monastic settings, where Charlemagne had significant influence, the rule of Saint Benedict set out times for nighttime prayers. Though Charlemagne's court was not a monastery, the expectation of prayer at certain hours seeped into courtly life. So a visitor might be swept from a lively meal to a hushed chapel, where candle flames burned more solemnly, and the mood shifted from performance to devotion. In both settings, light framed the experience. Outside the palace walls, the empire lay in relative darkness. The villagers had little more than hearth fires or small tallow candles. The contrast was stark. To step into the emperor's hall was to move into a different world, one of relative abundance and spectacle. It served as a reminder that wealth and power were not just measured in armies or land, but in the ability to command the very rhythm of day and night. Yet, for all this careful staging, The candlelit court was not immune to its own mishaps. Wax dripped, smoke rose, and sometimes flames caught a little too eagerly. Fire was an ever-present danger, and courtiers were no doubt aware of the risk. But even these small hazards fed into the aura of the evening. To be near the emperor was to live on the edge of shadow and flame, with the reminder that fortune could tip either way. So the nights at Charlemagne's court unfolded: meals, music, conversation, prayer, and the subtle dance of light and shadow. It was not a world of constant feasting or unbroken solemnity, but a blend of both, structured by ritual and softened by candle glow. The emperor may have preferred simple food and early sleep, but his court required more. Night was a time for hierarchy to be displayed, for scholars to murmur wisdom, and for candles to stand in quiet defiance of the dark. And as the last flames were finally pinched out, and the great hall sank back into silence, the empire itself seemed to hold its breath until morning, sliding further into the dim glow of those nights. It becomes clear that the court after sunset was not only a setting for display, but also a stage for personal habits, eccentricities, and the subtle oddities of medieval aristocracy. While Charlemagne's reign was remembered for its reforms, its wars, and the eventual crowning in Rome, the private spaces of his evening life contained details that, while less dramatic, may reveal just as much about the man and the world around him. The emperor himself was something of a paradox. By day he was tireless, issuing capitularies, attending assemblies, and hearing disputes brought before him. By night, however, he could be surprisingly low-key. Despite the glitter of candlelit halls, Charlemagne kept a personal routine that favored moderation. He preferred plain foods, as Eanhard carefully noted. Roasted meats, simple stews, and seasonal vegetables often sufficed, while exotic flavors brought in from distant regions were less appealing to him. Wine flowed in the court, but he rarely overindulged, preferring to remain sharp. His courtiers, of course, did not always share his restraint. The gap between ruler and retinue grew clearer after dark. Courtiers might push their luck with drink, jokes, or hushed gossip carried on the edge of a candle's light. A single careless comment could alter a career. In the flickering half-light, facial expressions were harder to read, which made whispers all the more dangerous. A smirk, mistaken for a sneer, could easily become the subject of suspicion. Charlemagne valued loyalty and discipline. Those who betrayed his trust rarely recovered. The candlelit nights, while sleepy on the surface, could sharpen political tensions. It is worth pausing to remember that these courts were not populated by polished Renaissance courtiers or 18th century aristocrats with powdered wigs. The Carolingian nobles were warriors, many of them large men accustomed to leading bands of armed followers. Their manners were often blunt, their laughter loud, their movements a bit unrefined. Yet when they stepped into the candlelight of Charlemagne's presence, they adopted a quieter, more formal demeanor. The rituals of the evening worked almost like a script, smoothing rough edges into something that resembled ceremony. The emperor's family played their own roles in these nightly gatherings. Charlemagne had numerous children, legitimate and otherwise, and his affection for them was well known. He insisted that his daughters remain at court, refusing to marry them off to foreign rulers despite political advantages such unions might have brought. At night, this decision shaped the social dynamics of the palace. His daughters were ever present, seated near him, often sharing in the music or conversation. Their presence provided warmth, but also introduced an odd twist. Powerful nobles, who might have expected to form alliances through marriage, instead lingered in the awkward position of guests who could not reach for such connection. Charlemagne's sons were educated and prepared for leadership, yet their roles in the evenings varied. Some joined the conversations on law or theology, others drifted toward military topics, and still others simply occupied their places quietly, absorbing the rituals of their father's court. The candlelit gatherings were as much a training ground as a social occasion. Here, the young heirs observed the subtleties of favor and disfavor, learning how a glance or a pause in conversation could weigh almost as heavily as a decree. Not every evening was devoted to food and talk. Some were marked by religious observances. Candles in these contexts served as both practical tools and spiritual symbols. The idea of Christ as the light in the darkness made the presence of fire and flame deeply resonant. To kneel in a dark chapel, illuminated only by thin columns of candlelight, was to participate in an experience that felt both intimate and overwhelming for Charlemagne, whose reign leaned heavily on the support of the church. These nighttime rituals reinforced the sacred legitimacy of his authority, yet the relationship between the court and the church was not always serene. Scholars and clerics could be sharp-tongued, and arguments about theology often arose. Imagine the scene, a hall filled with noblemen shifting in their seats, as two learned churchmen debated the proper phrasing of a creed. The flickering candlelight lengthened their shadows on the walls while the emperor leaned forward, listening with the patience of a man who knew that decisions on such matters could ripple across his empire. For the courtiers, such debates may have been less than thrilling, but they endured them, aware that the emperor's attention to detail extended even to points of doctrine. The candles themselves deserve more attention than they often get. In a society where light was scarce, their presence signaled wealth and intention. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, smoked and smelled unpleasant. Beeswax candles, however, burned cleanly and brightly, producing a steadier light. They were expensive, and their use in Charlemagne's court emphasized not only luxury but control over the natural world. Beekeeping was no small undertaking, and the ability to command wax in abundance meant access to wide networks of resources. Even the wax, then, was part of the empire's fabric. Light also created layers of experience within the hall. At the center, near the emperor, the glow was strongest, and faces could be seen clearly. Toward the edges, shadows grew, and conversations could be carried on with less scrutiny. This arrangement mirrored the politics of the empire itself. Clarity and attention focused on the center, while the outer regions slipped into a less certain semi-darkness, just as distant provinces required occasional expeditions to bring them back under control. The far corners of the hall required occasional glances to ensure nothing troublesome was brewing in the shadows. Of course, not every night was successful in its staging. Candles sputtered, servants stumbled, guests said things better left unsaid. Even the emperor himself could grow weary. Accounts describe him as attentive but not tireless, and as age advanced, his endurance waned. Nights may have shortened, conversations cut off earlier, the hall dimmed sooner. The symbolism of light battling darkness became more poignant as the emperor himself aged into his 60s, his once formidable frame slowing under the weight of years. The glow of candlelight became a reminder that even the brightest flame eventually gutters. For the courtiers, however, evenings remained a test. To be invited to the emperor's table at night was to stand on display. To be absent could be a sign of disfavor. Navigating these evenings was a skill, requiring a balance of attentiveness, restraint, and the occasional strategic word. Success could mean influence, lands, or command. Failure could mean nothing more than fading into obscurity. But in a world where obscurity meant loss of power, that was no small danger. Beyond the halls, ordinary life carried on in darkness. Villagers might gather around hearth fires, their conversations punctuated by the snapping of logs. Children drifted into sleep earlier than their noble counterparts, lulled by the crackle of fire and the weariness of daily labor. The contrast with the emperor's candlelit courts was immense, where one world sparkled with beeswax light, the other faded into smoky shadows. The empire was bound together by law and loyalty, but the gulf between palace and village was never more visible than after sunset. Still, within the emperor's circle, the nightly rituals wove together the strands of power, faith, and family. The candlelit court was more than spectacle. It was a carefully managed environment where the emperor's preferences shaped the mood, where hierarchy was reaffirmed, and where the empire's most powerful men and women learned their places by the faint glow of flame. The nights were neither grand festivals nor solemn vigils alone, but a mixture of both, a quiet assertion that authority extended even into the hours when most of the empire lay asleep. And as the candles burned lower, and servants trimmed wicks with careful hands, the empire's heart pulsed steadily, its rhythms carried by the interplay of light, shadow, and the presence of one formidable man at its center. Drifting deeper into the long shadows of the Carolingian evening, the figures moving through these candlelit halls coming to clearer view, not just as blurred outlines, but as individuals with quirks, ambitions, and occasional embarrassments. Charlemagne himself sat at the center, the fixed flame around which others circled, but the cast of supporting characters was large and restless. His court, even at its most dignified, was still human, which meant that it was full of odd habits, quiet rivalries, and the kind of awkward moments that can be softened by dim light and strong drink. One of the most prominent presences was Alcuin of York, the Anglo-Saxon scholar invited to Charlemagne's court to help shape what would later be called the Carolingian Renaissance. By day, Alcuin was a man of letters, drilling courtiers and clerics alike in Latin, correcting their grammar, and sighing heavily at their mistakes. By night, under the halo of candlelight, he transformed into something like a patient tutor at a very elite but somewhat unruly evening class. Charlemagne liked to surround himself with learning, though his own mastery of Latin was uneven, and his attempts at writing were never entirely successful. He kept wax tablets and styluses by his bed, but his handwriting remained clumsy. Still, the emperor valued scholarship, and so his evenings often included readings, recitations, or theological debates conducted in a haze of smoke and flicker. The atmosphere in such moments was peculiar, a mix of earnest devotion to learning and the low-level fidgeting of noblemen who would rather have been on horseback. Imagine armored lords, their rough hands more suited swords than styluses, nodding solemnly while a scholar pronounced Latin vowels with exaggerated clarity. The candles illuminated their faces just enough to show polite concentration, though one suspects more than a few stared longingly at the wine jugs. Charlemagne himself encouraged these sessions, both as a way of elevating his court and as a signal that his reign was not only about conquest, but also about order and enlightenment. Whether the courtiers always appreciated this education is another question entirely. Music, too, remained a staple of the night. Sometimes these were simple Frankish songs, sung by retainers with voices shaped more by battlefield shouts than careful training. Other times, chants filled the air, the deep tones of clerics echoing off stone walls while candlelight trembled in rhythm with the voices. For Charlemagne, music was not merely entertainment but a tool of unity. He sought to standardize liturgy across his empire, pressing for Roman practices to be adopted widely. Thus, even the evening chants became part of a larger imperial project, their melodies weaving through the dark halls as threads of control and cohesion. And yet, for all the ritual, evenings could still be awkward. The emperor's decision to keep his daughters close was unconventional for a man of his status. These young women were educated, presentable, and often admired by the courtiers. But Charlemagne refused to marry them off to strengthen alliances. Instead, they lived at court, which created a situation both domestic and faintly uncomfortable. The daughters occupied visible seats at table, sharing in music and conversation, but remained unmarried well into adulthood. Chroniclers hinted, delicately, that they were not exactly cloistered in chastity. But whatever the truth, their constant presence shifted the tone of the emperor's evenings. A visitor hoping to propose a dynastic match would quickly find himself disappointed, perhaps sipping his wine more quickly than intended under the unblinking light of beeswax candles. Charlemagne's sons added their own layers of intrigue. Louis, later known as Louis the Pious, tended towards seriousness and was often more at home in religious observances than in feasts. Charles the Younger and Pepin were more martial, prone to gestures and comments that reminded everyone of their roles as heirs to military command. The dynamics between the sons could simmer quietly, barely visible, until a candle caught the tension in a glass. The emperor no doubt noticed, though he rarely allowed family disputes to unfold openly in the evening rituals. Still, the candlelit court must have seen its share of strained silences, especially as succession questions loomed larger in his later years. The courtiers themselves were not uniform in style. Some were polished, accustomed to moving gracefully between feast and prayer. Others remained rough, their armor clanking uncomfortably against chairs, their attempts at polite Latin producing more groans from Alcuin. Candlelight revealed these contrasts vividly. A polished noble might raise a cup with practiced ease, while his neighbor spilled wax down his sleeve, grimacing as he tried to pretend nothing had happened. The court was, in this sense, less like a flawless performance, and more like a human comedy, softened by shadows and the steady hum of ritual. Servants, though rarely described in detail, were essential to maintaining the illusion. They trimmed wicks, replaced candles, carried dishes, and tried to avoid drawing attention unless absolutely necessary. A dropped platter could echo embarrassingly through the hall, drawing glances, sharp enough to send the unfortunate servant stumbling into the dark. Yet, without them, the entire performance would have collapsed. The empire's greatest men and women relied on the invisible labor of those who kept the candles burning. Evenings also exposed the emperor's physicality in subtle ways. Charlemagne was tall and broad, but as he aged, his movements slowed. He suffered from fevers and other ailments in his later years, and though he maintained dignity, fatigue often crept in. Courtiers may have noticed the slight heaviness in his step, the way he leaned a little more heavily on his chair as the night grew long. Candlelight, flattering though it could be, could not entirely mask the truth of time. For men whose fortunes depended on imperial favor, the sight of their emperor aging must have carried both sympathy and a sharp edge of anxiety. Religion was never far from these nights. Prayers closed many gatherings, and processions to chapels, filled with candles, provided a solemn counterpoint to the livelier meals. These moments underscored the idea that Charlemagne's reign was sanctified, not merely political. To move from feast to prayer in a matter of minutes reinforced the notion that earthly power and divine order were intertwined, both visible in the glow of candlelight. Of course, one should not over-romanticize. By smoke, drafts swept through halls and wax dripped onto polished wood. Candles provided light, but not much of it. and people squinted more often than we might imagine. The evenings were long, sometimes tedious, and not every participant was entranced by theological readings or political posturing. But even boredom served its purpose. To sit through a dull evening in the emperor's presence was to demonstrate loyalty, patience, and the willingness to endure for the sake of one's place. It was in these nightly scenes, more than in the chronicles of wars or treaties, that the true fabric of Carolingian politics was woven. Who sat where, who spoke when, who drifted too close to the shadows. All of these details mattered. Authority was not just declared by day, but reinforced by night, in the glow of beeswax candles that made the empire's order tangible even in darkness. And so, as the evening wore on and the candles burned lower, the empire revealed itself in miniature, bright at the center, fading at the edges, full of whispers, rituals, and the slow pulse of power carried into the night, sliding onward into the later years of Charlemagne's reign. The candlelit courts acquired an air of both continuity and fragility. The rituals remained: meals, prayers, music, and long conversations. But with each passing decade, the emperor's presence shifted subtly. Where once his broad frame had been the steady center of every evening, time gradually reshaped him into an older man, marked by illness and weariness, though still determined to maintain the patterns that bound his empire together. The glow of beeswax candles, which had once emphasized vigor and authority, began instead to soften the outlines of age, casting a gentler but more fragile light on the emperor's face. As Charlemagne aged, he became increasingly attached to the chapel at Aachen. The Palatine Chapel, with its octagonal design and glittering mosaics, became not only his spiritual refuge, but also the physical heart of his empire. In the evenings, the transition from feasting hall to chapel was almost seamless. Servants carried candles from one space to another, creating a continuous line of light that guided the courtiers through dim corridors. The effect was deliberate. The emperor's worldly power and spiritual devotion were not separate, but joined together in a single path, illuminated by steady flames. To kneel in that chapel at night, with mosaics glinting faintly in the candlelight, must have felt both humbling and overwhelming, especially to nobles more used to drafty wooden halls than to imperial marble. These rituals were not without their ironies. Charlemagne, who demanded discipline in matters of liturgy and order, was himself increasingly irregular in his physical condition. He suffered fevers and fatigue, sometimes cutting evenings short, sometimes absent altogether. Yet the court persisted, for to halt the rituals entirely would have been to admit weakness. The candles kept burning, even if the emperor's participation wavered. In a way, the persistence of light became symbolic of the persistence of the empire itself, continuing through illness, distraction, and the inevitable wear of time. His daughters remained an unusual presence at court. Well into adulthood, they continued to sit by their father's side in the evenings, an arrangement that still puzzled visitors. Their role in music and conversation softened the atmosphere, but their unmarried status kept the court in a perpetual state of suspended possibility. Courtiers whispered, discreetly, about the political matches that never came. The daughters themselves appear to have lived with a degree of freedom unusual for women of their rank, though the details are murky. What is clear is that their presence kept the emperor's nights personal, almost domestic, even as the rituals were designed to display imperial grandeur. The emperor's sons were another matter. As succession loomed larger, their positions grew more significant, and their behavior more scrutinized. Louis the Pious, the most devout, often stood out for his seriousness, sometimes seeming more monk than prince. His brothers, Charles and Pepin, carried the martial expectations of their lineage, but their roles were complicated by politics and geography. The tension between them simmered beneath the calm surfaces of the evening meals, occasionally flashing in sharp exchanges that candlelight could not disguise. To be in the hall during such moments was to witness the delicate balance of family and empire teetering in real time, the glow of the candles throwing both harmony and discord into relief. The courtiers adapted to these shifting dynamics with varying degrees of success. Some excelled at reading the emperor's moods, offering just the right comment or retreating into silence at the right moment. Others misjudged, pressing too hard for favors or indulging too freely in wine. A single slip could undo years of careful positioning and the half-lit spaces of the court, where faces were visible, but expressions were softened. Subtle missteps carried outsized consequences. For those navigating the hierarchy, the candlelit evenings were both opportunity and trap. Beyond the palace walls, the empire itself was far from tranquil. Wars against the Saxons, campaigns in Italy, and the management of distant provinces demanded attention. Yet, within the candlelit halls, the sense was of a world under control, bounded by ritual. The evenings created a kind of artificial calm, a space where the emperor's authority was not challenged by rebellion or negotiation, but simply reaffirmed through presence. This contrast between the turbulence of the wider empire and the ordered stillness of the court was striking. The candles did not just illuminate, they created a temporary illusion of stability, a fragile glow holding chaos at bay. The emperor's own habits, though simple, remained central to the rhythm of these nights. He often preferred roasted meats, bread, and vegetables, avoiding overly rich or exotic dishes. He drank moderately, rarely allowing himself to be carried away. His dislike of excessive extravagance was well known, yet his court nonetheless staged abundance for the sake of appearances. This contrast between his personal preferences and the needs of spectacle was a quiet irony, played out night after night. Charlemagne may have wanted simplicity, but his empire demanded grandeur, and so the candles burned on. The question of light itself remained symbolic. To have an abundance of beeswax candles was to demonstrate wealth and command over resources. To control when and how the dark was pushed back was to show mastery over the natural world. The emperor's court, in its nightly rituals, declared that power extended not only over armies and provinces, but also over the very rhythm of day and night. Darkness outside the palace was untamed, filled with uncertainty. Darkness within the palace was domesticated, structured, and safe. That distinction reinforced the emperor's authority in ways both subtle and profound. Still, the nights were not without their hazards. The fire remained a constant danger. A tipped candle, a careless sleeve, or a sudden draught could transform ritual into disaster. Servants moved with care, their hands steady, their eyes alert. The memory of past fires lingered in every hall, an unspoken reminder that control was always precarious. The irony of using flame as a symbol of order, while knowing it could consume everything, was never far away. The evenings also revealed the limits of power. For all his authority, Charlemagne could not prevent aging, illness, or the occasional misbehavior of courtiers. The candles softened these realities, but did not erase them. The emperor himself, nodding as a reading droned on, or excusing himself early from a feast, was as human as anyone else in the hall. His courtiers may have whispered about it, quietly, but they also understood to witness their emperor aging was to confront their own fragility, and so the candlelit courts persisted, both luminous and shadowed, full of ritual, yet threaded with quiet unease. They were places where power was displayed and reinforced, but also where the human side of empire, fatigue, awkwardness, aging, was revealed. The candles burned not just to illuminate, but to disguise, creating a world where grandeur and vulnerability flickered side by side. As the nights deepened and the wax dripped lower, the empire seemed to hover between strength and fragility, caught in the same delicate balance as the flames themselves. Drifting into the heart of those later nights, the candlelit court began to take on the texture of memory itself, hazy, flickering, shaped as much by absence as by presence. The rituals continued, but now they carried a weight of repetition, as though each meal, each prayer, each scholarly reading was less about novelty and more about maintaining the familiar shape of authority. For Charlemagne, the evenings became less about proving himself and more about reminding everyone that the empire still revolved around his presence, however slowed or softened it had become. The visual language of candlelight made this all the more poignant. In a hall glowing unevenly with beeswax, the emperor's face would appear sometimes sharp, sometimes blurred, depending on the angle of the flame. It was a symbolic image, the ruler both present and slipping toward absence, his authority real, but already edging toward legacy. Courtiers watched him closely, but not always with admiration. They measured his endurance, gauged his health, and calculated how their own positions might shift in a world without him. In the glow of candlelight, ambition sharpened even as lips murmured prayers for his well-being. Among the most constant features of these evenings was conversation. Charlemagne's court did not roar with endless laughter or collapse into silence. Instead, it moved at a steady, deliberate pace. Topics ranged from law to scripture, from the management of distant lands to the finer points of Latin declension. The emperor enjoyed history read aloud, though his fatigue sometimes overtook him. Still, the act of listening itself was a form of performance, a signal that learning had a place at the imperial table. Courtiers who hoped to impress might bring small pieces of knowledge or clever turns of phrase, careful not to appear boastful. The balance was delicate. Too much enthusiasm for scholarship might look pretentious, too little might look dull. The emperor's scholars, Alcuin among them, provided a steady supply of material. They read from Roman authors, Christian fathers, and Carolingian capitularies. Their voices filled the hall, droning softly as shadows quivered along the walls. These readings were not meant for entertainment in the modern sense. They were exercises in order, discipline, and identity. To hear Roman history under Frankish candlelight was to place the Carolingian Empire within a lineage stretching back centuries. Each word, each pause, reinforced the notion that the empire was Yah to Rome, not merely a patchwork of tribes united by conquest. The courtiers tolerated this theater of learning, though some more gracefully than others. For a warrior noble, the prospect of sitting through a debate on theology may not have inspired delight. Yet they stayed, because absence could be dangerous, and because the emperor noticed even weariness was safer than neglect. Besides, the atmosphere itself softened everything. Candlelight has a way of blurring edges, making even the dullest sermon seem faintly dreamlike. Perhaps more than one noble found himself drifting, lulled by the rhythm of the reader's voice and the steady flicker of flame. Music provided a gentler counterpoint to such readings. Chants rose in slow waves, their tones carrying through the hall and chapel alike. These sounds were less about melody and more about structure. They created a sonic order to match the visual order of candlelight. Together, sound and light formed an environment where time seemed suspended. where the turbulence of the outside world could be momentarily set aside. This was not joy in the sense of lively entertainment, but reassurance, a reminder that the empire held steady, at least within the palace walls. The emperor's family continued to occupy visible roles. His daughters remained beside him, participating in music and conversation, their presence still puzzling foreign visitors. Their unmarried status, a deliberate decision by their father, added an odd note of defiance to the otherwise orderly rituals. These women were well educated and closely involved in courtly life, yet their futures were deliberately constrained. The court adjusted to this reality, though the occasional awkwardness was inescapable. Candlelight could disguise wrinkles or fatigue, but it could not disguise the tension of choices left unresolved. His sons, meanwhile, carried heavier burdens. As the emperor's health declined, the question of succession became unavoidable. Louis the Pious was the most obvious heir, but his personality differed sharply from his father's. Where Charlemagne was pragmatic and commanding, Louis leaned toward piety and introspection. This contrast worried some, reassured others, and shaped the undercurrents of the court's evenings. Every glance between brothers, every measured silence at the table, was interpreted as a sign of the future. The candles threw these subtleties into relief, highlighting the small expressions that carried outsized meaning. Even as imperial business intruded on evenings, the rituals remained carefully staged. The seating arrangements, the order of dishes, the timing of prayers, all followed a choreography that reinforced hierarchy. Nothing was accidental. To sit closer to the emperor was a privilege. To be seated further away a warning. Candlelight reinforced these divisions. Those near the emperor were bathed in warm glow. Those at the edges lingered in shadow. It was politics made visible through flame. The servants who kept the system running did so with quiet precision. They trimmed wicks, replaced candles, refilled goblets, and carried platters, moving constantly but discreetly. Their work was both essential and invisible. Their presence acknowledged only when something went wrong. A clattering dish or a sputtering candle could momentarily interrupt the illusion of order. Yet even these small mishaps contributed to the sleepy rhythm of the night. The empire's grandeur was never seamless, always stitched together by human hands in the flicker of firelight. The emperor himself often sought rest earlier than he once had. He had never been a lover of extravagance, and in his later years the strain of long evenings grew heavier. Still, he maintained enough presence to signal continuity. Even when fatigue showed in his posture, his mere attendance was enough to hold the ritual together. The courtiers noticed, of course, but they adjusted. The empire's stability was as much about perception as about reality. And so the candles burned until the emperor chose to rise. Beyond the palace, the world slipped into darkness. Villages settled into silence, monasteries into ordered prayer, roads into shadow. The contrast between the emperor's illuminated hall and the darkness outside was striking. It was a reminder that power meant not only armies and laws, but the ability to command light itself. To make night behave according to human will. The empire was vast, but in the end its unity was fragile, and the candlelit court was both a symbol of that unity and a fragile flame against the darkness. And so the nights went on. Predictable, ritualized, quietly political, softened by wax and flame. They were not moments of high drama, but of subtle reinforcement, where power whispered rather than shouted, where the emperor's presence was enough to keep the empire glowing for another day. And as the years slipped further into the early 9th century, the candlelit evenings of Charlemagne's court began to resemble a slow performance staged against the backdrop of inevitability. The emperor was older now, visibly so, and though still formidable in stature, his endurance was fading. The court continued its rituals with unwavering regularity, but everyone present knew that the glow of those candles now fell across a man who was not eternal. This knowledge lent the evenings a strange mix of calm and unease, like watching a fire burn low while pretending the flame was steady. Charlemagne had always preferred simplicity, but the court refused to let simplicity be the dominant note. The empire was too vast, too full of ambitious nobles and restless bishops, to allow its emperor to appear plain, and so the evenings pressed forward with the same choreography, banquets laid out with measured order, scholars stepping forward to read, music rising in solemn chant, and the quiet movement of servants trimming wicks and replacing candles. It was a play performed not for entertainment, but for reassurance. The Palatine Chapel at Aachen featured more prominently than ever in these later years. Charlemagne had built it not only as a palace chapel, but as a symbol of imperial grandeur, a space that connected him to Rome and to heaven. At night, its mosaics shimmered faintly, reflecting candlelight in fractured glints across the marble surfaces. The effect was one of multiplication. A handful of flames seemed to become dozens, surrounding the gathered courtiers with a glow far greater than the fuel consumed. This illusion was not lost on anyone. It mirrored the empire itself, vast and luminous, though its true foundations were sometimes far thinner than appearances suggested. The emperor's health shaped the rhythm of these evenings. He was prone to fevers and digestive troubles, conditions that lowered him but did not remove him from view. He continued to eat modestly, preferring roasted meats and vegetables, while those around him indulged more freely. His restraint was deliberate, part of his lifelong aversion to excess, but it also reflected necessity. To appear at table, even if weary, was to remind his court that he was still at its center. The candles could not hide the weariness, but they softened it, giving his presence the aura of dignity, even as strength ebbed. The courtiers, meanwhile, adjusted their behavior carefully. In an aging emperor's court, every action carried double meaning. A nobleman who leaned too eagerly into Louis the Pious's circle risked seeming disloyal. One who clung too tightly to Charlemagne might appear blind to reality. The candlelit halls became arenas of subtle calculation, where gestures were weighed as heavily as words. Even silence could be read as a signal, and all of this unfolded under the watchful gaze of flames that revealed enough to notice, but not enough to confirm. The emperor's daughters remained at his side, their presence now so established that few questioned it openly. They participated in music and conversation, their laughter and voices echoing through the dim hall or the court. Their unmarried state continued to carry political implications, but for the emperor their presence provided comfort. In the candlelight, the family element of his evenings softened the formality, making the court feel less like a machine of state and more like a household, albeit one that stretched across much of Europe. Louis the Pious, the heir apparent, also played a larger role in these later evenings. He was devout, serious, and at times so pious that his demeanor felt almost monastic. His presence contrasted with the emperor's practical vigor, highlighting the change in style that the empire would face upon succession. Courtiers watched him with a mixture of curiosity and weariness, trying to predict how his reign would differ. Candlelight revealed him less as a warrior prince than as a solemn, slightly austere figure. For some, this was reassuring. For others, it was troubling. The rhythms of scholarship continued, though they too reflected the passage of time. The readings from Roman history, theological treatises, and Carolingian decrees still filled the evenings, but Charlemagne was sometimes too tired to listen for long. He had once tried to learn to write, keeping wax tablets by his bed, but by now it was clear he would never master it. The scholars pressed on, regardless, their voices rising and falling in the dim air, while the emperor listened as long as he could. The symbolism of learning mattered more than the details. To gather in candlelight and hear the words of Rome and the church was to affirm the empire's place in a larger order, even if attention wandered. Outside the palace, night fell heavily. Villages darkened quickly, with only hearths and a few tallow candles to keep shadows at bay. Travelers avoided the roads, monasteries filed into their chapels, and silence spread across fields and forests. Inside, however, the court remained luminous, a bubble of light in an ocean of dark. This contrast was striking, a constant reminder of how rare and deliberate such illumination was. Light was not simply a convenience, but a demonstration of wealth, control, and authority. Every flame burned with meaning. The hazards of flame never disappeared. Servants remained vigilant, and accidents, though rare, were always possible. Fire had the power to undo everything, to turn ritual into ruin. Perhaps that danger only heightened the symbolism of control. The emperor's court could tame even the most volatile element, harnessing it to create order. The candles were both fragile and powerful, much like the empire itself. Evenings in these later years carried a sense of waiting for the emperor's health to fail, waiting for succession, waiting for the empire to shift into its next form. The rituals held everyone together, but beneath the surface, uncertainty hummed quietly. The courtiers might laugh at a remark, lift a cup of wine, or murmur along with a chant, but their eyes often slid toward the emperor, measuring how many more evenings like this would be possible. The candles illuminated not just the present, but the awareness of an approaching end. And so the court carried on, night after night, the glow of beeswax smoothing over fatigue, illness, and ambition. The empire seemed steady, but the shadows lengthened. The emperor, once the flame at the center, now flickered like the candles themselves, still burning, still luminous, but undeniably mortal. Drifting further into the twilight of Charlemagne's reign, the court's candlelit evenings began to feel like rehearsals from memory, scenes staged again and again so that when the emperor finally slipped away, the empire would remember him not in battle or council alone, but in the calm glow of ritualized nights. By this point, the great hall and chapel were less places of debate and more theaters of continuity. Each meal, each reading, each chant reinforced the illusion that nothing had changed, even as everyone could see that everything was quietly changing. Charlemagne was still the anchor, but his physical decline was difficult to ignore. His once commanding figure had softened, his movements slowed, and his strength waned. He suffered from fevers, limped at times, and found long evenings draining. Yet he insisted on presence, for absence would signal vulnerability in ways more dangerous than fatigue. To sit at the table, to bow his head in prayer, to listen to a droning reading, even briefly, was enough to affirm that the empire's axis remained intact. The candles, mercifully, were forgiving, their flicker concealing as much as they revealed. The courtiers adjusted with careful sensitivity. They did not gush with sympathy, for pity was dangerous. Instead, they maintained the familiar rhythms, laughing softly at the right moments, murmuring assent during readings, raising goblets when expected. Beneath these gestures, however, calculations deepened. Each noble measured his position, not only in relation to the emperor, but also in relation to Louis the Pious. The air, solemn and devout, was increasingly present at these evenings. his demeanor less commanding than contemplative. His seriousness was evident in the candlelight, the furrow of his brow, the way he listened intently during prayers, the almost monastic calm that distinguished him from his father. Some found reassurance in this piety, others worried it signaled a future of rigidity rather than strength. The emperor's daughters remained fixtures, their presence by now a fact of life. Visitors may have raised eyebrows at their unmarried state, but to the court it had become almost normal. They sang, they played instruments, they joined in conversation, their laughter filling the dim air when other voices faltered. Their presence softened the hall's severity, though it also kept alive a quiet sense of unfinished business. They were women of status without dynastic marriages, a lingering puzzle that candlelight could not dissolve. Evening rituals continued much as before, food served in orderly fashion, prayers recited, scholars stepping forward to read. But the atmosphere had shifted subtly. What once felt like imperial assertion now felt like an act of preservation. The empire was vast, still formidable, but also stretched thin, and the emperor's mortality cast a shadow longer than any candles. Courtiers listened to Roman histories with ears more attuned to legacy than to instruction. Each word reminded them that empires rise and fall, and that their own place in the story was precarious. Music remained essential, though it too took on a more somber tone. Chants filled the chapel in slow, resonant waves, their echoes hanging in the air long after voices fell silent. In those moments, the court seemed suspended outside of time, caught between the glow of candles and the weight of eternity. The emperor listened, sometimes with eyes closed, not always out of prayer, but often out of fatigue. Still, the act of being present was enough. Even silence was political. Even weariness became ritual. The servants, as always, held everything together. They trimmed wicks, replaced candles, carried dishes, and kept the machinery of ritual running smoothly. Their quiet movements were the invisible foundation on which the evening rested. Without them, the illusion of order would collapse into smoke and shadows. It was a curious irony that the empire's greatest lords, its bishops and heirs, relied entirely on the steady hands of those who rarely received acknowledgement. The hazards of flame remained, too. Wax dripped steadily, pooling on tables and floors. A sudden draught could send a candle sputtering, plunging part of the hall into shadow before the wick was coaxed back to life. These small disruptions served as reminders that even the most carefully staged evenings were vulnerable to accident. The empire itself felt much the same, grand, luminous, but always one mishap away from fracture. The emperor's modest tastes continued to contrast with the abundance around him. He ate simple food, drank in moderation, and disdained excess. Yet the court itself staged abundance, as though compelled to prove something on his behalf. Platters of meat, jugs of wine, and pools of candlelight gave the impression of plenty, even if the emperor himself preferred restraint. This contrast was not lost on the courtiers. Some saw it as proof of his discipline, others as evidence of his detachment from spectacle. Either way, it shaped the atmosphere of every evening. What made these nights so potent was their blend of the personal and the political. There were family dinners, with daughters and sons gathered around an aging father. There were also imperial performances, with nobles, bishops, and scholars acting out the hierarchy of empire. Candlelight blurred the boundary, allowing intimacy and grandeur to coexist in the same space. For courtiers, this duality was both comforting and unsettling. They were part of a household and an empire simultaneously, never entirely sure which identity mattered more. As the evenings wore on and wax burned lower, the sense of waiting thickened. The emperor's health could not hold forever, and everyone knew it. Each night carried the faint air of rehearsal for what would come after. Louis stepping more firmly into his role, courtiers adjusting their alliances, scholars preparing to preserve the emperor's legacy. The candles, glowing softly, seemed to know it too. Their light was steady, but not infinite, their flames always moving toward an end. And so the nights of Charlemagne's court, once vibrant with assertion, became slow, measured, almost elegiac. There were nights of continuity and denial, of ritual and anticipation, where the empire's future lingered just out of reach, visible only in the flicker of flame and the heavy silence that settled when the last candle guttered out. And at last the candlelit evenings of Charlemagne's reign reached their quiet conclusion, tapering much as the wax itself did, in a slow and steady decline that was more resignation than drama. By the time the emperor entered his final year, in 814, the court had long since adjusted to the rhythm of age and frailty. The rituals of night persisted, food, prayer, readings, chants, but they had become as much about holding on to habit as about celebrating power. Each evening was less a demonstration of strength than a quiet insistence that life continued in the same patterns, even as the shadows lengthened. Charlemagne was still formidable in reputation, but physically he was worn down. He walked with difficulty, his appetite had diminished, and he often left the hall earlier than before. Yet he clung to the symbolic act. To appear in candlelight even briefly was to remind the court that authority had not yet slipped away. His presence, softened and reframed by the flicker of beeswax, was itself a form of command. For courtiers who had known him in vigor, the sight was bittersweet, a reminder that even the mightiest ruler must eventually bow to time. The evenings themselves grew quieter. Conversation was subdued, music slower, prayers longer. Louis the Pious took on more visible responsibilities, guiding the rhythm of the court, his piety casting a more somber tone across the rituals. His seriousness was unmistakable, his demeanor closer to that of a monk than a warrior. Candlelight illuminated his solemn features, signaling to everyone present that the future of the empire would be marked less by his father's pragmatism and more by his own devout restraint. Some found comfort in this, others doubt, but none could deny that the transition was already underway. The emperor's daughters remained near him to the end. Their presence, constant and familiar, gave the evenings a domestic warmth, even in the face of imperial uncertainty. They joined in chants, played music, and conversed softly, their laughter quieter now, but still threading through the halls. Their unmarried status remained an oddity, but by this late stage it was no longer a subject of speculation. It was simply the reality of Charlemagne's court, one last eccentric feature of an otherwise carefully managed empire. The courtiers continued their delicate balancing act. They paid respect to the aging emperor while carefully aligning themselves with Louis. Every gesture, every glance, was weighed for its implications. Candlelight, with its habit of softening details, provided cover for these small negotiations. But the political reality was clear. The empire was preparing to shift, and the evenings had become rehearsals for that inevitability. The rituals of scholarship, though less energetic, persisted. Readings from Roman histories and theological texts still filled the air, though Charlemagne's attention sometimes faltered. He had long since abandoned attempts at writing, but he still valued the performance of learning. To gather in candlelight and hear the words of antiquity was to affirm, one last time, that the Carolingian Empire stood in the lineage of Rome. It was a gesture of continuity, a claim that even as the emperor faded, the light of knowledge remained. The chapel at Aachen was the most enduring stage for these final nights. Its mosaics, reflecting faint candlelight, turned each service into a vision of shimmering gold and shadow. They are surrounded by courtiers, clerics, and family. Charlemagne prayed in a setting that symbolized both the grandeur of empire and the fragility of human life. The chapel's glow outlasted his strength, promising that the institution would endure even when the man at its center was gone. Outside the palace, the world carried on in its own darkness. Villages ended their days early. Monasteries kept their hours of prayer, and the empire stretched in uneasy silence across forests, rivers, and plains. Inside, however, the bubble of candlelight lingered, holding back the dark just long enough to sustain the illusion of stability. It was an illusion everyone needed, for without it, the vast empire might have felt too fragile to hold together. When Charlemagne finally died in January 814, the candles burned as they always had, but now they framed absence rather than presence. The rituals of night continued, but with a new figure at their center. Louis the Pious inherited not only the throne, but also the weight of these nightly performances, the responsibility of maintaining the fragile glow that symbolized order in a world of shadows. In retrospect, the candlelit courts of Charlemagne reveal as much about medieval power as any battlefield or decree. They show how authority was performed through ritual, how hierarchy was illuminated by flame, and how even the strongest rulers relied on fragile light to shape perception. They remind us that empire was not only a matter of conquest and law, but also of atmosphere, of evenings where wax burned, shadows stretched, and an aging emperor sat at the center, holding darkness at bay for just a little longer. The candles eventually guttered out, as all candles do. The empire endured, though fractured in time, its glow dimming unevenly across generations. Yet in those long, quiet evenings, the Carolingian world imagined itself as steady, luminous, and eternal. And for as long as the flames held, so too did the illusion. This story closes like a candle flickering out. But in the dark, another flame sparks to life, pulling us deeper into the night. This is the shadow of Petra, life among the rose-red cliffs. When the sun began to lower behind the rugged hills of Edom, the cliffs around Petra shifted into something otherworldly. The stone, naturally streaked in reds and pinks, deepened into shades that made the city seem aflame, though no fire burned. This was the world of the Nabateans, a people who turned desert into a kingdom and carved their presence directly into the cliffs. Their lives, often imagined through the dazzling facades of Petra's tombs and temples, were in fact a blend of practical desert survival, ruthless trade calculation, and the kind of small personal dramas that rarely make it into textbooks, but almost certainly filled their evenings. Petra, founded long before Rome's rise to dominance, became the Nabatean capital by the 4th century BCE. It was not the only city in the region, but it was the one that most perfectly embodied their talent for turning inhospitable landscapes into centers of wealth. Situated in what is now southern Jordan, Petra sat at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and beyond. It was a place where caravans carried frankincense, myrrh, spices, and textiles, and where merchants lingered, waiting for deals to be struck and for safe passage to be arranged. By day, the city was alive with movement. Camel caravans padded in and out, their bells jangling, their loads shifting. Merchants argued, scribes counted, and guards kept careful watch. But by night, when the air cooled and shadows filled the canyons, Petra became something else entirely. The great tombs carved into rock faces loomed like silent guardians. their columns and facades faintly illuminated by oil lamps. Families gathered in courtyards cooking modest meals, while wealthier households held quieter feasts, their conversations muted by the echoing cliffs. It was a city of trade, but also a city of shadows, where the grandeur of architecture contrasted sharply with the fragile reality of daily life. The Nabateans were known for their engineering, particularly their water systems. In a desert where rainfall was scarce, they carved channels, cisterns, and reservoirs to capture and store what little came. By daylight, these systems were practical marvels, keeping the city alive. At night, when oil lamps flickered against walls, the sound of water trickling into carved basins must have been both soothing and uncanny. Imagine the silence of a desert evening, broken only by that sound, an artificial river whispering through stone. It was as much a symbol of power as the tomb facades. To control water was to control life, and to sit beside a private cistern at night was to feel the security of wealth. Yet, wealth brought tension. Petra's grandeur was built not on peaceful isolation, but on control of trade routes, which meant constant negotiation, occasional conflict, and a degree of ruthlessness. The Nabatean kings ruled from Petra, but they were never entirely secure. Their court, though less recorded than those of Rome or Byzantium, surely had its share of rivalries and jealousies. In the quiet of night, while lamps burned low and the desert air cooled, these tensions surfaced in whispered conversations. Who would inherit? Who had offended whom at the last feast? Who was angling for more influence with the king? The cliffs, for all their grandeur, held secrets as surely as they held tombs. The most striking features of Petra remained the monumental facades, the so-called treasury, the monastery, and dozens more. These were not houses, but tombs carved to proclaim status long after death. By day they dazzled, catching the sun. By night they brooded, their darkened doorways like mouths gaping into Eto. For the living, the presence of so many tombs must have given evenings in Petra a peculiar quality. To sit outside sharing a meal by lamplight was to do so beneath the watchful gaze of ancestors and the silent reminder of mortality. The grandeur of life in Petra was always undercut by the weight of death, carved into stone. Families lived not in tombs but in houses, some cut directly into the cliffs, others built in the open spaces between. These domestic settings, though less impressive, were the heart of the city. Children played, women tended to household tasks, and men returned from trade or governance. At night, the lamps glowed inside cave-like rooms, creating a honeycomb of faint light scattered through the cliffs. From a distance, Petra must have looked alive, the rock itself studded with fireflies of human presence. Yet within each home, life was ordinary. Meals of bread, dates, and lentils, talk of caravan arrivals, complaints about taxes or neighbors. The grandeur of the treasury was less relevant to the daily question of whether water jars were full and trade goods intact. The Nabatean elite, however, lived with more extravagance. Archaeology has revealed traces of large houses with painted walls, imported ceramics, and luxurious objects. At night, these households hosted gatherings, where music and drink softened the edges of political maneuvering. The wine flowed. Nabatea was known for viticulture, and conversations ranged from trade deals to dynastic concerns. The shadows of these evenings were long, not just because of the oil lamps, but because of the ambitions that stretched across them. The wealth that kept Petra glowing also bred unease, for every show of power invited envy. Religion added its own presence to the night. The Nabateans worshipped a variety of deities, some with Arab origins, others influenced by Hellenistic traditions. Shrines dotted the cliffs, and processions surely wound their way through canyons by lamplight. At night, sacrifices may have been offered, incense burned, and prayers whispered toward the stars. The desert sky above Petra was immense, brilliant with constellations. For people accustomed to navigating trade routes by starlight, the heavens were not only divine, but practical. Night was both sacred and useful, a reminder of the thin line between survival and transcendence. The court of Petra, like any royal household, was a world of its own. Kings such as Aretas IV ruled during Petra's height, and their authority radiated outward from these rose-red cliffs. Their evenings likely included councils of advisors, scribes recording transactions, and envoys from distant lands arriving to negotiate. The flicker of oil lamps on polished surfaces turned politics into theatre, and each gesture carried weight. To be seen at the king's table was honor. To be excluded was a warning. The same rules that applied in Charlemagne's candlelit courts held true here, though the accents, foods, and gods were different. Power at night was always about display and inclusion, and Petra was no exception. But Petra was not immune to decline. By the 1st century CE, Rome's influence pressed closer, and eventually the Nabatean kingdom was absorbed into the empire. Even then, the city remained important, but its independence was gone. The knights changed, too. Roman administrators and soldiers brought new rhythms, new rituals, perhaps new arrogance. The grandeur of the facades remained, but the identity of the court shifted, diluted into a wider imperial structure. The oil lamps still burned, but the conversations were no longer purely Nabatean. For some, this must have felt like betrayal. For others, inevitability. Still, the city endured, its nights filled with the same mixture of grandeur and fragility. Petra was never a place of endless festivity. It was a place of endurance, a city carved into stone because permanence was both desired and elusive. Its nights reflected that duality, magnificent in architecture, ordinary in domestic life, and always shadowed by the awareness that sand and stone outlast all. To live among the rose-red cliffs was to live in constant dialogue with mortality, ambition, and the delicate glow of light against overwhelming dark. And as each night descended and the lamps sputtered low, Petra itself seemed to breathe alive with whispers, shadows, and the faint memory of a people who made the desert sing with stone. Sliding further into the shadows of Petra, the focus shifts from the monumental facades that dominate the tourist's imagination to the quieter, lived realities of the Nabatean city. The grandeur of the treasury or the monastery often obscures the fact that Petra was not just a gallery of tombs, but a functioning urban center filled with markets, workshops, households, and a constant churn of people passing through from distant lands. At night, the tension between spectacle and survival became especially clear. The Nabatean elite might have dined in stone-carved halls, their lamps glinting on painted walls and polished vessels imported from the Mediterranean. But most of Petra's residents experienced evenings more modestly. Their homes were often small chambers carved into the cliffs or constructed structures built in open spaces. Oil lamps provided light, fueled by olive oil imported in large quantities since the local land was poor for cultivation. The glow from these lamps was dim, smoky, and expensive to maintain, meaning families used them sparingly. For many, night was a time of conserving resources, relying on moonlight or firelight rather than endless flame. The city's markets closed with dusk, but the echoes of trade lingered. Merchants who had spent the day haggling over the price of incense or spices gathered with their peers to tally profits and plan next moves. Caravan leaders, their camels stabled and watered, rested near the city gates. For them, Petra was not a destination, but a pause, a place to regroup before striking out again across the harsh desert routes. The city at night was full of such contrasts, locals settling into routines, foreigners passing through, and elites arranging politics over wine. The Nabateans were deeply pragmatic, but they were also human, with the small habits and eccentricities that creep into every society. Some households may have sat up late, grinding grain or repairing tools by lamplight. Others likely told stories, reciting genealogies or retelling the exploits of earlier kings. The cliffs echoed with voices, laughter, arguments, all the domestic sounds that rarely survive in history books. The tombs may dominate the cliffs, but the living filled them with far messier, humbler rhythms. Water management remained central, even after sunset. The Nabateans had carved channels to direct rare rainfall into cisterns, and at night families drew from these reservoirs to cook, clean, or prepare for the next day's journeys. The sound of water being poured into clay jars was part of Petra's nightly music. Wealthy homes had private cisterns, while poorer families shared public ones. The inequality was stark. Some residents could wash more freely, while others rationed every drop. Candlelight reflected off water jars, making even a small trickle shimmer like treasure. Religion infused the city's nights as well. Shrines and altars dotted the landscape, and rituals often took place after dark. The Nabateans worshipped deities such as Dishara, the chief god, and Alorza, associated with fertility and protection. Offerings of incense and oil were common, their smoke curling upward into the starry desert sky. These rituals blurred the line between domestic and divine, since many altars were modest and close to homes. The air of Petra at night was often tinged with the sweet, resinous scent of burning incense, a fragrance that marked wealth, but also devotion. The desert sky itself was part of life, free from modern light pollution. Petra's nights were blanketed with stars, brilliant and overwhelming. For traders, the constellations were guides, helping them navigate the vast trade networks that made the Nabateans rich. For families, the same stars framed their prayers, hopes, and stories. Children may have lain on rooftops or in courtyards, tracing shapes in the sky as parents muttered about caravan schedules or tax collectors. The cliffs around them glowed faintly in moonlight, their rose-red hue muted into shadow. Petra's royal court, meanwhile, staged its own performances. Kings such as Aretas IV presided over lavish gatherings where foreign envoys were entertained, and deals were sealed in the flicker of oil lamps. These evenings were not merely social, they were political theatre. Who sat near the king, who spoke first, who remained in shadow, all signaled favour or disfavour. Just as in Charlemagne's court centuries later, the staging of light and seating arrangements carried meanings as sharp as any decree. An envoy from Rome or Alexandria, stepping into a Petra audience chamber, would have seen a spectacle carefully designed to project wealth and control. Yet, these courts were never free of tension. Factions within the Nabatean elite schemed over influence, inheritance, and control of trade. The quiet murmur of conversation could hide sharp rivalries, and the shadows of lamplight provided cover for whispers that might otherwise draw dangerous attention. The grandeur of carved facades disguised the fragility of politics, just as candlelight disguised fatigue in Charlemagne's halls. Every empire, it seems, leaned on fire to hide its flaws. Ordinary Petra life, though, continued with less drama. Families closed their doors against the chill, settled children to sleep, and prepared for another day of work. In poorer districts where houses lacked painted walls or imported luxuries, evenings may have ended quickly, with households conserving oil and rising early at dawn. The contrast between elite and ordinary life was striking, visible even in light itself. Some households glowed steadily with multiple lamps, while others sat in near darkness. Light was not just comfort, it was a marker of status. Still, for all its contrasts, Petra shared something with every human settlement: the rhythm of night, bringing people closer together. Conversations grew quieter, meals more intimate, and the city's noise faded into the murmur of voices echoing off stone. The cliffs themselves seemed to participate, amplifying sounds, holding them briefly, then letting them fade into the desert air. Life in Petra was not only carved into stone, but carried on in these ephemeral sounds, fleeting and fragile, but no less real. And so the city at night balanced grandeur with intimacy, power with vulnerability. The rose-red cliffs loomed above, monuments to permanence, while oil lamps flickered below, reminders of how temporary human life really was. The Nabateans built a city to last, but they lived their nights like everyone else, surrounded by shadows, waiting for morning, and whispering their stories into the dark. Drifting deeper into the rose-red shadows, Petra reveals itself not just as a city of grandeur, but as a place where ordinary habits rubbed against extraordinary settings. The facades carved into sandstone cliffs gave the impression of permanence, but the people living beneath them carried on lives that were temporary, fragile, and sometimes quietly absurd. Nightfall, in Petra, did not erase these contrasts. It magnified them. Take, for example, the tension between public monument and private dwelling. The monumental tombs, with their elaborate columns and carvings, shouted wealth into eternity. Yet only a short distance away, families huddled in small, dimly lit rooms, their walls rough and uneven. Oil lamps burned reluctantly, sputtering when the air turned damp, and the smell of smoke clung to clothing. Children fidgeted as mothers scolded them for knocking over clay jars, and fathers muttered about the price of spices or the unreliability of caravan guides. All of this happened in the shadow of facades built to proclaim immortality. It was a constant reminder that the afterlife had better lighting than most Nabatean kitchens. The city's water systems, so admired by modern archaeologists, also shaped nightly routines. Water did not flow endlessly. It had to be managed carefully. Households stored it in jars, rationed it for cooking, and saved washing for daylight. But in wealthier homes, water features became displays. Imagine an evening gathering where a small trickle of water was allowed to flow in a courtyard basin, reflecting lamplight. Guests murmured politely, knowing that the host was essentially showing off a controlled miracle. In the desert, nothing was more impressive than making water behave like decoration. Trade, of course, dominated conversation. Petra was a city of middlemen, its wealth built on controlling routes rather than producing goods. At night, merchants calculated profits by lamplight, tallying how much incense or spice would fetch in Damascus or Alexandria. Caravans brought not only goods but stories, rumors of Roman campaigns, Egyptian politics, or unrest in Arabia. These stories spread quickly in the confined spaces of Petra, whispered in homes, repeated in markets, and perhaps exaggerated over wine. The cliffs heard it all, absorbing gossip as readily as echoes. The royal court amplified these dynamics. The king's palace, though less preserved today than the tombs, would have been the stage for evening councils. Oil lamps lit long tables, and scribes leaned over wax tablets while advisors debated strategy. Who should control which caravan route? How much tax should be demanded? Should Rome be flattered or resisted? These questions played out in the flicker of flame, every decision shadowed by uncertainty. The Nabatean kingdom was strong, but it sat between greater powers. At night, the vulnerability of its position was impossible to ignore. Religion, too, lent Petra's evenings a peculiar quality. The worship of Dushara, the chief deity, often involved rituals at high places carved into cliffs by torchlight. Processions would climb narrow steps to altars perched above the city. The flames reflected on stone, turning the cliffs into glowing walls. From below, families might have watched pinpricks of fire move along ridges, hearing distant chants carried by desert wind. These rituals must have been both awe-inspiring and faintly eerie, a reminder that divine power hovered over human life, always watching, always demanding. Inside households, domestic rituals unfolded more quietly. Meals were simple: bread, dates, pulses, sometimes meat or fish, if resources allowed. Wine was common, though not in endless supply. Afterward, lamps dimmed as families prepared to sleep. Beds were often nothing more than mats laid on floors, and the cool desert air seeped into chambers. The contrast with elite households, where music and wine stretched evenings late into the night, was stark. Petra was a city of inequalities, and light itself revealed them. The poor went to bed in shadow, the wealthy lingered in glow. The tombs themselves added another layer of unease to Petra's nights. Their grand facades loomed silently, doorways yawning into darkness. Children must have glanced nervously toward them, half convinced that ancestors stirred within. Adults, too, likely felt the weight of living so close to death. The grandeur of tombs was meant to display status, but in practice it made the city feel haunted. To walk past them at night, hearing only the echo of one's footsteps, was to remember that life in Petra was temporary, while stone endured. Foreign visitors added further strangeness. Greek and Roman envoys, accustomed to marble cities, were struck by Petra's fusion of desert austerity and architectural ambition. They dined with the king, listening to Nabatean music and drinking wine by lamplight, and perhaps later wrote confused reports about this kingdom of traders who carved palaces for the dead but lived humbly among the living. Their presence altered the city's evenings, introducing new fashions, new words, and new gestures, but Petra remained itself, proud, pragmatic, and slightly aloof. For the ordinary people, though, the rhythms were simpler. Night brought fatigue. The day's work hauling water, tending animals, bartering in markets, left little energy for extended festivities. Families drifted to sleep early, lulled by the sound of wind through canyons. Only occasionally did larger gatherings break the quiet, such as weddings or festivals, when torches illuminated processions and music echoed late into the night. Those evenings were exceptions, rare bursts of brilliance in a city otherwise content to fade into shadow until dawn. Petra's nights, then, were not only about monuments, but about lives lived in their shadows. They were about the contrast between grandeur and fragility, permanence and transient. The Nabateans carved their city to last, but their evenings looked much like those of any desert people. Meals, conversations, small rituals, and the constant awareness that survival depended on water, trade, and the fragile flame of oil lamps. And as the city settled each night into quiet, the cliffs loomed above, reminders that human life flickers, but stone holds the memory long after the lamps go out. Sliding once more into the rose-red cliffs, Petra at night becomes less about monuments and more about the strange intimacy of a city that was both cosmopolitan and provincial. At the same time, caravans from Arabia, Egypt, and Syria flowed in and out, bringing news of distant empires. But once the lamps were lit, life returned to routines that were as familiar as they were fragile. The Nabatean kingdom thrived on trade, but its nights reminded everyone that even the most powerful cities were at the mercy of water, politics, and the unpredictable desert. The royal court, under kings like Aretas V, projected confidence by staging feasts and councils where light was carefully managed. Envoys from Rome or Alexandria might find themselves seated in a grand hall, the walls painted with colorful patterns, oil lamps casting shimmering reflections on polished vessels. The message was unmistakable. Petra was not a provincial backwater, but a kingdom worth respecting. Yet, beneath the grandeur, the same anxieties hum. Would Rome tolerate Nabatean independence? Would rival Arab tribes disrupt trade? These questions hung in the air, unspoken but unavoidable, as wine was poured and incense burned. For the wealthy, evenings could be indulgent. Archaeological traces reveal imported goods, fine ceramics, glassware, and luxury textiles that set elite homes apart. Their lamps burned longer, their music played later, and their conversations were thick with ambition. Azatas and his successors used such gatherings to bind loyalty, to reward allies with feasting, and to sideline rivals by leaving them in shadow. In Candlelit politics, inclusion and exclusion mattered more than any official decree. Meanwhile, ordinary Petra households lived on a different scale. Families might have eaten simple meals of lentils, flatbread, and dates before extinguishing their lamps early to save oil. Children fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through canyons, and adults sat quietly, planning for the next day's work. Merchants worried about caravan schedules, herders about the health of camels, and laborers about tax. Their evenings lacked grandeur, but they shared something the elites often missed: a closeness to one another, unembellished by politics. Religion remained a thread through these nights. Torches lit processions to high places where offerings were made to Dashara, or where incense curled skyward toward the stars. These rituals turned the city itself into a stage for devotion. From below, one might see faint fire moving along ridges, hear chants carried faintly by desert air, and feel the cliffs themselves hum with sacred presence. Religion in Petra was not confined to temples. It was carved into the landscape, etched into daily life, and reflected in every lamplight that flickered near a household altar. The tomb facades, though silent, were never absent. Their presence at night was almost oppressive. By day they were dazzling, but by night they became looming silhouettes, their doorways gaping like mouths into darkness. To live among them was to be constantly reminded of mortality. Every household, no matter how modest, was overshadowed by these carved monuments to the dead. Children likely whispered stories of spirits lurking in their depths, and adults must have felt the same unease when walking past them under starlight. Petra's beauty carried with it a heaviness, a reminder that stone was eternal while flesh was not. Foreigners brought both wealth and unease. Roman officials, Greek traders, and Egyptian envoys passed through the city, bringing with them not only new goods but new expectations. A Roman guest might be entertained with Nabatean wine, listening politely to local music, while making mental notes about how easily this kingdom might be absorbed into imperial structures. The Nabateans knew it too. Their evenings with foreigners were performances, carefully staged to project confidence, but also tinged with quiet dread. To host Rome was to dance in shadow. The ordinary sounds of Petra at night were modest. The shuffle of camels in their pens, the murmur of water pouring into jars, the crackle of cooking fires reduced to embers. Yet when the wind picked up, the canyons turned these sounds into echoes, magnifying them until they seemed larger than life. A child's cry might bounce from cliff to cliff. A single word of gossip might carry further than intended. The very geography of Petra made privacy difficult. The cliffs amplified not only music and prayer, but also quarrels and secret. As the 1st century CE progressed, Rome's shadow lengthened over Petra. The city continued its evening rituals, but the knowledge of dependence on a greater power must have shaped the atmosphere. The lamps still burned, the wine still poured, the chants still rose, but everything felt provisional, as if the cliffs themselves knew that Petra's independence was temporary. In 1006 CE, the kingdom was formally annexed into the Roman Empire, and Petra became a provincial city. Its knights changed with it. Roman administrators introduced new rhythms, new officials, and new expectations. The Nabatean kings vanished, replaced by imperial governors. The royal feasts gave way to Roman banquets. The rituals shifted to align more closely with Roman religion and bureaucracy. Yet the cliffs remained, and the tombs still loom. For the people of Petra, the change must have felt both sweeping and strangely irrelevant. They still lit their lamps, still rationed their water, still whispered under the stars. Empires rose and fell, but domestic life, lived in the shadow of cliffs, went on. And so Petra's nights became layered with memory. Nabatean rituals, Roman rule, and the unchanging desert sky above. The rose-red cliffs, carved with ambition and permanence, continued to outlast the fragile rhythms of human life. Each evening reminded the city's residents that survival was temporary, but stone endured, drifting further into Petra's story under Roman rule. The nights began to change in ways both subtle and profound. When the Nabatean kingdom was absorbed in 10 CE, the rhythms of the city did not vanish overnight. Lamps still burned in carved dwellings, caravans still rested in the valley, and families still told stories under the stars. Yet over time, the glow of Petra's evenings reflected a new order, one where Rome's presence seeped into every layer of life. Roman governors and soldiers introduced their own rituals, where Nabatean kings had hosted feasts in painted halls. Now Roman officials presided over banquets that echoed imperial customs. The oil lamps may have been the same, but the conversations shifted. Discussions that once centered on caravan routes and local alliances now included taxes owed to Rome, decrees from distant emperors, and the logistics of integrating Petra into a far larger system. For some residents, this change was frustrating, a reminder that their city no longer ruled itself. For others, it was opportunity, a chance to align with imperial power and secure favor. Religion, too, shifted slowly. While the worship of Nabatean gods continued, Roman deities and imperial cult practices began to creep into the city. At night, torches might illuminate processions to altars not only of Dushara but also of Jupiter or Roma. The blending of traditions was not seamless. Families clung to their ancestral rituals even as officials encouraged loyalty to new divine figures. In practice, Petra became a city of overlapping faiths, its cliffs echoing with prayers in more than one language. The oil lamps glowed on altars old and new alike, their flames softening the sharp edges of cultural change. The architecture of Petra reflected this mixture. Roman theatres and colonnaded streets appeared alongside Nabatean tombs. At night, the new colonnades cast shadows that intersected with those of older facades. as if two worlds were layered on top of one another. To walk through Petra after dark was to feel history pressing from multiple directions at once, the past whispering even as the future advanced. Yet, even under Rome, Petra remained a city of trade. Caravans still came, bringing incense from Arabia and spices from India. Goods that Rome craved, merchants still gathered in courtyards at night to count profits, argue over deals, and swap stories. Their lamps burned late, fueled by the wealth that trade continued to bring. But the balance had shifted. Rome now dictated the terms of trade, and Petra's independence was gone. The lamps that once symbolized sovereign power now flickered under imperial shadow. For ordinary residents, life changed less dramatically. Families still rationed water, still prepared simple meals, still ended their days by lamplight. Children still listened to stories about ancestors, though now those stories included warnings about Roman officials and tales of resistance or cooperation. The cliffs remained the same, their tombs looming silently. But the meaning of those facades shifted. They no longer proclaimed the power of living kings, but stood as reminders of a lost kingdom, their grandeur tinged with melancholy. Over the centuries, Petra's evenings grew quieter as Rome's priorities shifted, trade routes moved, and Petra's importance declined. Caravans bypassed the city, wealth faded, and its population dwindled. Nights that had once echoed with music, laughter, and political intrigue grew subdued. The oil lamps still flickered, but fewer and fewer households kept them burning. Darkness reclaimed the city, slowly but relentlessly. By late antiquity, Petra was a shadow of its former self. Christian communities emerged, and new rituals filled the evenings. Prayers in churches, chants, rising at night services, lamps glowing on altars that spoke of resurrection rather than desert gods. The cliffs, ever patient, absorbed yet another layer of history. Nabatean, Roman, Christian, all left their marks, all flickered briefly before fading. And yet, even in decline, Petra retained its strange power. To live among the rose-red cliffs was to live with constant reminders of ambition, mortality, and the fragility of human effort. At night, when the wind moved through the canyons and the stars glimmered overhead, the city seemed to breathe with memory. Every lamp that burned was both a defiance of darkness and a confession of its inevitability. In time, the lamps went out altogether. Petra slipped into obscurity, its cliffs holding their secrets in silence. But for centuries before that silence, its nights were alive with voices, laughter, prayers, and ambitions, fragile human flames flickering against stone that outlasted them all. And as Petra drifted further into late antiquity, its nights reflected not just change, but a slow unraveling. The city that had once thrived on caravan routes and royal courts was still inhabited, still alive with flickering lamps and whispered voices. But its pulse had weakened. Rome's grip had loosened, not out of generosity, but because the empire itself was overstretched and Petra was no longer essential. The city's evenings, once full of political performance and mercantile bustle, became quieter, more provincial, and more fragile. The decline of Petra's trade was most visible at dusk, when fewer caravans arrived. In earlier centuries, the arrival of camels had filled the air with sound, bells clinking, drivers shouting, beasts groaning under their loads. At night, those caravans had rested in the outskirts, their presence swelling the city's population temporarily, their campfires glowing against the cliffs. But as trade routes shifted toward the Red Sea and Roman naval control grew stronger, fewer caravans came, the campfires dwindled, and the city grew darker. Families noticed the absence keenly. Nights once marked by the lively chatter of foreigners grew silent, leaving only the echo of wind in the canyon. Christianity brought new rituals, reshaping Petra's evenings in quieter ways. Churches were built within the city, their walls still decorated with mosaics that survive faintly today. Evening prayers replaced older rituals to dushara and oloza, and oil lamps glowed in new sanctuaries. The chants of Christian monks and priests echoed differently than Nabatean hymns or Roman processions. They were more subdued, more insistent on humility, but they carried the same sense of seeking light in darkness. For residents, this shift must have been jarring. Old gods carved into cliffs still loomed nearby, their altars often abandoned, while new faith demanded allegiance. Night became contested space, one flame extinguished as another was lit. Petra's architecture, too, told the story of decline. The grand facades still towered, but many dwellings fell into disrepair. At night, fewer lamps glowed from cliffside homes, and entire quarters sank into shadow. In wealthier times, the city had looked like a constellation carved into stone. Light scattered across the valley. Now it seemed patchy, a few stubborn flames flickering in a landscape of silence. Families who remained adjusted, but the sense of loss must have been palpable. Every darkened dwelling was a reminder of neighbors gone, fortunes lost, and a city shrinking into itself. Nature added its own challenges. Earthquakes rattled Petra in the 4th century CE, damaging buildings and disrupting water systems. At night, this instability was most visible in silence. Reservoirs that once trickled steadily now lay empty. Houses cracked, their lamps extinguished for good. Survivors patched what they could, but the rhythm of the city faltered. The desert was patient, and the desert always waited. Without constant maintenance, Petra's fragile balance with water slipped. Night after night, families carried jars further to find what little remained, their lamps swinging in the dark as they walked. Still, life persisted. Children still played in courtyards until dusk. Women still cooked evening meals, and men still gathered to talk over bread and wine. Stories still passed from one generation to the next, though now they carried a tone of nostalgia, tales of kings long gone, caravans that no longer came, nights when Petra had been luminous with wealth. The cliffs, unchanging, made those stories believable, even if the city no longer matched them. By lamplight, memory and reality blurred. For those who stayed, Petra's evenings must have carried a strange intimacy. With fewer people, the city was quieter, but that also meant closer bonds. Families leaned on each other more, shared more, and kept traditions alive in smaller circles. Religion anchored them, with Christian services providing structure to nights that might otherwise have felt too empty. Where once torches had climbed cliffs to high places, now lamps glowed in chapels. Where psalms replaced incense smoke, the change was profound, but the human need for ritual remained constant. Travelers who passed through in this period still found Petra striking, but they described it less as a bustling trade hub, and more as a curious relic, a city of tombs overshadowing the living. At night, that impression would have been even stronger. The silence of the canyons, broken only by occasional prayers or the cries of animals, made the city seem like a ghost of itself. The facades, always magnificent, now looked like monuments to a greatness fading fast. And yet, decline was not collapse, not yet. Petra lingered for centuries, its nights sustained by stubborn residents who refused to abandon the cliffs. Lamps still flickered in homes carved into rock. Children still fell asleep under the vast desert sky, and families still whispered stories into the dark. The city was weaker, yes, but not lifeless. Petra's evenings were shadows of their former brilliance, but shadows still move, still breathe, still remember. The rose-red cliffs, unchanged in their grandeur, continued to watch over these diminished nights. Stone outlasted empire, faith, and trade. The people who lived there may have felt small in comparison, their lamps like fragile sparks against the immensity of rock. But in their persistence, they carried the last breath of Nabatean legacy forward. And so the city's nights remained quieter, emptier, but still alive, still whispering beneath the cliffs, as if refusing to let darkness claim them completely. And in the long centuries after Petra's annexation into Rome, and then its gradual decline under shifting trade patterns, the city's evenings settled into a rhythm that felt more like survival than spectacle. Gone were the royal courts, the lavish banquets, and the caravans that once filled the canyons with noise. What remained was smaller, quieter, and in many ways more human. The city endured as a provincial settlement, its grandeur fading but its people stubborn enough to cling to life among the cliffs. By the Byzantine era, Petra was no longer the crossroads of empires, but a city of local farmers, craftsmen, and clergy. At night, instead of envoys negotiating by lamplight, one might hear the hum of Christian hymns rising from modest chapels. Oil lamps glowed faintly inside small stone buildings, their light less a display of wealth than a necessity. Against the darkness, families gathered in courtyards for prayers, meals of bread and lentils, and quiet conversation. The rose-red cliffs, once a backdrop for politics, now framed evenings of humble devotion. Still, the memory of Petra's grandeur lingered. The monumental tombs loomed as reminders of a past that seemed almost mythical. Children growing up in Petra must have stared at the facades by moonlight, asking their parents who had carved them, who had lived in such power, and why it had all faded. Parents probably gave stories half true and half invented, passing on the sense that their home was both sacred and haunted. The tombs gave the city a strange quality at night, as if the dead were larger presences than the living. Earthquakes continued to unsettle Petra, most notably in 3060 CE, which damaged many of its buildings. After such tremors, evenings were marked by repair rather than ritual. Families huddled together, their lamps burning low, whispering prayers that walls would not fall again. Fear left its imprint on the night, joining the already present silence of decline. The cliffs were strong, but human structures were fragile, and every tremor reminded the residents of that imbalance. The city's isolation deepened as centuries passed. By the early Islamic period, Petra had slipped into obscurity. Travelers still passed through occasionally, and local communities remained, but the city's pulse slowed. At night, the silence of the desert grew heavier, broken only by the call to prayer, the bray of animals, and the murmur of small communities keeping traditions alive. The rose-red cliffs watched silently as Petra transformed from a hub of wealth into a quiet town, its grandeur preserved only in stone. Yet, even in decline, Petra's evenings had a beauty of their own. The desert sky remained brilliant, unspoiled by light pollution. Families still gathered around fires, telling stories as sparks drifted upward into constellations. The cliffs still echoed with human voices, though fewer now. The tombs, still magnificent, were repurposed by some as dwellings or storage, their original intent forgotten. Lamps burned where once only the dead had been expected to reside. It was a quiet irony that in decline, the city blurred the boundary between life and monument. By the Middle Ages, Petra was nearly forgotten by the outside world. Nights in the city must have felt like living inside a memory, with echoes of grandeur, but none of its weight. For those who stayed, life was practical, tending goats, gathering water, trading modestly, yet they still lit lamps against the dark, still whispered stories beneath the cliffs, still lived in the shadow of facades that seemed almost too large for their quiet existence. Petra had been built to impress traders, kings, and gods, but in its later centuries it served humbler purposes. The knights no longer held councils or processions, but prayers and small meals. Still, the cliffs preserved everything. The stone held the memory of ambition, even as human lives moved on. Each lamplight was a fragile echo of what had been, a reminder that grandeur may fade, but human persistence continues in small gestures. Bread shared, prayers whispered, lamps lit against overwhelming dark. And so Petra's decline was not a collapse, but a long fading, its nights shrinking from spectacle to survival, from empire to memory. Yet even in this state, the city remained hauntingly alive, proof that life persists even in shadow, even in silence, even when the world has moved on. And finally, Petra drifted into near silence, its nights reduced to little more than echoes. What had once been a city of kings, merchants, and caravans was by the late medieval period a place known mostly to locals and forgotten by the wider world. The rose-red cliffs still loomed, their facades still dazzling by day and haunting by night, but their meaning had shifted. They were no longer symbols of power, but backdrops for the persistence of small communities, the ordinary lives of people who lived in the ruins of grandeur, travelers who stumbled upon Petra in these centuries often described it with awe and confusion. By lamplight, the facades looked like the work of giants, their scale overwhelming in the dim glow. Locals used some tombs as dwellings or stables, their lamps flickering in doorways carved centuries earlier for kings and nobles. The irony was striking. Chambers once meant for eternal rest now housed goats, tools, and families. The grandeur of death had become the practicality of life. At night, the faint light spilling from these carved spaces made the cliffs seem both inhabited and spectral, as though Petra's past and present were living uneasily together. The desert itself reclaimed the city's rhythms. Sand-filled channels once used to direct water, and silence spread across colonnaded streets. Nights were colder, darker, quieter than they had been in Petra's prime. Families gathered close around fires, their stories about ancestors blending fact with legend. To them, the cliffs were simply home, but they also carried the weight of mystery. Living in Petra meant living with reminders too large to ignore, reminders that every flame flickers out, eventually. For centuries, Petra remained this way, half inhabited, half forgotten. Its evenings were modest, defined by survival rather than spectacle. Oil lamps glowed only in a handful of homes. Fires crackled in courtyards, and prayers rose into the dark. The grand processions, royal banquets, and foreign envoys were gone. What remained was smaller, but no less human. Children falling asleep under the desert sky, parents whispering prayers for water and safety, communities holding on to life in the shadow of monumental stone. By the time European explorers rediscovered Petra in the 19th century, its nights had long since lost the grandeur of the Nabatean and Roman ages. The city was quiet, inhabited by local Bedouin communities who had their own rhythms, their own rituals, their own lamps burning faintly against the cliffs. For outsiders, it seemed like a ghost city. For those who lived there, it was simply home. The cliffs, carved centuries before, were still alive with human presence, even if that presence no longer matched the grandeur of the facades. And so the story of Petra's nights is one of contrasts. In its prime, it glowed with power, wealth, and ambition. Under Rome, it flickered with compromise and adaptation. In decline, it grew quiet, intimate, and fragile. Yet through it all, the rose-red cliffs endured. They watched as lamps flared and guttered, as rituals shifted from gods to emperors to Christ, as families whispered different prayers beneath the same stars. The stone remembered everything, even when the world forgot. To imagine Petra at night is to imagine both presence and absence, both glory and shadow. It is to see oil lamps glowing in carved doorways, to hear water trickling faintly through channels, to feel the immensity of cliffs towering above fragile human lives. It is to know that people lived here, loved here, worried here, and fell asleep under the same stars we see today. The cliffs outlasted them, but their nights remain, echoes in stone, whispers in the dark, a reminder that human ambition burns brightly, briefly, and always in the shadow of eternity. May this story settle in your heart like a whisper, and may your dreams be calm and kind. Good night.